My name is Jacob Fabry, but everyone just calls me Jake. I am, or perhaps was, a civil engineer. For 5 years, my world was a grid of concrete and steel, a symphony of deadlines, and the ceaseless, grinding noise of a city that never slept. I designed foundations for buildings that scraped the sky, structures meant to last a century, yet I felt my own foundation crumbling day by day. The life I had meticulously planned felt like a cage I had built for myself. I was successful, I was stable, and I was profoundly, soul-crushingly miserable. The burnout wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow erosion, a grinding down of my spirit, until all that was left was a hollow ache and the constant hum of anxiety. So I quit. I liquidated my assets, packed a few essentials into my aging Subaru, and drove west, chasing a half-formed idea. A romantic notion born from books and old photographs. I was seeking what the brochures and lifestyle articles call the quintessential Western experience. I wanted silence. I wanted a horizon that wasn't serrated by skyscrapers. I wanted to feel small again, to be an observer of a landscape so vast that my own anxieties would shrink to their proper, insignificant size. I read a quote somewhere that to be a successful lookout, you need to be comfortable in your own skin beforehand, that it's not a place to escape your problems. I dismissed it as gatekeeping. Of course it was an escape. That was the entire point. That's how I found myself applying for a seasonal position as a fire lookout with the U.S. Forest Service. It seemed like the perfect antidote to my former life. The job description itself was a poem of solitude. Live in a small cabin on a mountaintop. Watch the wilderness for smoke. Be a guardian of the forest. I read about the history, the legacy of these lonely sentinels, and felt a pull I couldn't ignore. It was, I told myself, a way to reconnect with something real and tangible after years of living in the abstract world of blueprints and stress projections. Some part of me knew I was running, but I convinced myself I was running towards something, not just away from the noise. I was seeking a life-changing experience, a hard reset for a soul worn smooth by the relentless friction of modern life. I got the job. My post was a tower on a place called Pinyon Peak, a remote summit deep within the sprawling green expanse of the Nez Perce, Clearwater National Forest in Idaho. The name itself felt like a good omen, a link to the land's deep history, a place where the memory of the Nez Perce people was etched into the very mountains and rivers. This, I thought, was where I could finally find some peace. This was where the world would go quiet. The journey to the tower was a gradual shedding of the world I knew. The interstate gave way to a state highway, then to a paved county road, and finally to a winding, rutted dirt track that climbed relentlessly into the mountains. My Subaru, a veteran of city potholes, protested the abuse, but I pushed it onward. The air grew thin and sharp, scented with pine and damp earth. For the last 2 miles, the road was impassable. I parked the car, shouldered my pack, and began the final ascent on foot. When I first saw it, it took my breath away. Pinyon Peak Lookout was a perfect icon of the wilderness. A 14 by 14 foot wooden cab. A box of windows perched atop a 40-foot steel tower a lone sentinel watching over an ocean of trees. It was, as one lookout described her own tower, a glass house on top of a mountain, a place of total exposure and unparalleled perspective. The forest below wasn't just a collection of trees. It felt like a single, living entity, ancient and breathing. The sheer scale of it was humbling. The peaks and valleys rolled away in every direction, fading into a hazy blue infinity. This was a land that held its own stories, a place where the veil between the physical and the spiritual felt thin. I felt a profound sense of rightness, a conviction that I had made the correct choice. The first week was idyllic. I fell into the rhythm of the lookout's life, a routine that appealed to the engineer in me. The job was one of meticulous observation, a litany of small, crucial tasks. I would wake with the sun, the 360-degree windows leaving no room for shades or sleeping in. After a breakfast cooked on the small propane stove, I'd clock in on the radio at 9:30 a.m. My world was governed by a simple, vital mandate every 15 to 20 minutes. I was to perform a complete scan of my territory with my binoculars. The heart of the tower, and of my job, was the Osborne Fire Finder. It was a beautiful piece of antiquated technology, a circular map of my region overlaid with a rotating brass ring and 2 sighting mechanisms. It was a tool of pure logic. Spot a smoke, align the front and rear sights, and read the azimuth, the directional bearing, from the ring. With that single piece of data, I could pinpoint a potential disaster on the map and radio the location to dispatch. It was a way of imposing a grid of human order onto the beautiful chaos of the wilderness. I loved its precision. Twice a day, at 10:30 a.m. and 30:30 p.m., I'd copy down the weather broadcast from Central Dispatch. At 6:00 p.m., I'd clock out. The days were long, quiet, and filled with a profound sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I read, I wrote in a journal. I watched eagles ride the thermals. The silence was a balm. The first whisper of wrongness came on my 8th day. It was a clear, hot afternoon. The air was thick with heat haze, the distant ridges shimmering as if seen through water. I was in the middle of a routine scan, my binoculars sweeping methodically from left to right. My gaze passed over a deep, trackless canyon to the northeast. I swung back. For a split second, framed perfectly in the crosshairs of the fire finder, I saw it, a thin, gray plume of smoke rising straight up in the still air. My heart hammered. Adrenaline, pure and sharp, flooded my system. This was it. The real thing. I noted the azimuth, my hands surprisingly steady, and consulted the map. Section 12, Township 38 North, Range 5 East. A nasty, inaccessible spot. I looked up from the map, back through the sights to confirm the visual before making the call. It was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. I scanned the entire canyon again, inch by painstaking inch. Nothing. Just the endless green canopy and the shimmering heat. It couldn't have dissipated that fast. A fire doesn't just vanish. I spent the next hour watching that spot, my gut churning. Finally, I wrote it off. A trick of the light. A dust devil. The heat playing with my eyes. I made a note in my official log. Foul smoke, possible heat shimmer. Sector NE. But the explanation felt thin an excuse I was telling myself. That night, the silence I had come to cherish felt different. It felt heavier, pressed against the glass of the cab. As I lay on my cot, drifting towards sleep, I heard a sound from outside. A faint, intermittent scratching. It sounded like it was coming from the catwalk just outside the door. Scrabble, scratch, scratch. I sat up, listening. The sound was delicate, almost furtive. My mind immediately went to the wildlife I'd seen. There were pikas and chipmunks everywhere, tiny thieves, who would try to make off with anything not nailed down. It was probably just one of them, its claws making noise on the metal grating of the catwalk. I lay back down, pulling the blanket up to my chin. It's just an animal, I told myself. You're in their world now. You have to get used to their noises. But as I stared up at the ceiling, listening to the wind sigh around the corners of my glass house, a new feeling began to creep in, cold and unwelcome. It was the first prickle of a fear I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the fear of loneliness which I had craved. It was the fear of not being alone at all. The rational part of my brain, the engineer, had logged the day's events as explainable phenomena. But another, older part of my mind wasn't so sure. It looked out into the vast, indifferent darkness of the Idaho wilderness and wondered what, exactly, was looking back. The unsettling feeling from that first night lingered like the morning fog in the valleys below. For a few days, life returned to its peaceful, monotonous rhythm. I performed my scans, logged the weather, and tried to convince myself that the false smoke and the scratching had been products of an overactive imagination, a city mind struggling to adapt to the profound silence. But the wilderness wasn't silent anymore. It was listening. The anomalies began to accumulate, small tears in the fabric of my orderly world. One morning, I found my heavy hand axe, which I always kept propped just inside the cab door, lying on the ground 40 feet below, nestled in the dirt at the base of the tower's steel legs. There was no wind that night strong enough to blow it out the door and over the railing. I had to make the long climb down and back up to retrieve it, my eyes scanning the tree line the entire time. I told myself I must have left it on the catwalk by mistake, and it had vibrated off. A flimsy explanation, but better than the alternative. The scratching sound returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the faint skittering of a small animal. This was louder, more deliberate. It was the sound of something being dragged slowly across the glass of the windows. A rhythmic, grating scrape that set my teeth on edge. It always came from the side of the tower, facing away from the moon, from the deepest darkness. The first time I heard it, I burst out of the cab with a powerful flashlight, heart pounding, but the catwalk was empty. There was nothing there. Then came the light. It was well after midnight. The sky a star, dusted velvet sheet. I couldn't sleep. I was scanning the horizon with my binoculars, more out of nervous habit than professional duty. And I saw it. A single point of light, like an old-fashioned lantern, moving slowly through the trees in a part of the forest the maps showed as trackless, rugged wilderness. It wasn't a hiker's headlamp. It was too steady, its glow too soft and yellow. It moved without bobbing, gliding through the dense undergrowth, where no trail existed. I watched it for nearly an hour, until it simply winked out. The next morning, I reported it. The voice on the other end of the radio was polite, but I could hear the skepticism. "We'll keep an eye on it, Pinyon Peak. Probably just some campers who went off trail. They found nothing." Of course they didn't. My sanctuary, my glass house on the mountain, was beginning to feel like a display case. The 360-degree views that had once felt so liberating now felt like a constant, unblinking state of exposure. I started to feel watched. It was a primal, physical sensation, the kind of feeling that makes the hair on your arms stand up. I was being observed, and whatever was observing me was patient. The discovery happened on a Tuesday. The air was thick with the smell of rain, and I was doing a deep clean of the cab. An engineer's attempt to impose order on a world that was rapidly losing its sense. While sweeping under the cot, I noticed one of the floorboards was slightly loose. Curiosity piqued, I pried at it with my fingers. It came up easily. Tucked into the dusty space below was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. My hands trembled slightly as I unwrapped it. Inside was a slim, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The first page had a name written in faded ink. Harvey Miller, Lookout, 1996. Finding a predecessor's log wasn't unusual, but this was clearly a private journal, not an official one. I sat on the cot and began to read. For the first several entries, Harvey's experience mirrored my own. He wrote of the profound beauty, the quiet majesty of the place, the satisfaction of the work. He documented the weather, the wildlife, the simple joys of solitude. Then, about 2 weeks into his season, the tone began to shift. He wrote about a strange plume of smoke that vanished. He wrote about scratching sounds on the glass. He wrote about seeing alone, inexplicable light moving through the trees at night. My blood ran cold. I was reading my own experiences, written down by a man 2 decades before I'd ever set foot here. The journal became more frantic, the handwriting more jagged. Harvey wrote of waking in the dead of night to see a woman standing at the edge of the tree line, just watching him. A woman with a smile that was too wide, too fixed. He wrote of seeing a cougar near the tower, but one that was unnaturally large and black as pitch, its eyes glowing in the dark. And then he gave it a name. A name he'd learned from an old Nez Perce man, a seasonal ranger who had visited him once and, seeing the fear in Harvey's eyes, had shared a piece of forbidden lore. The Pumwa, according to the old man's story, which Harvey had transcribed in painstaking detail. The Pumwa was a witch, a shapeshifter. She was one of the first peoples, a daughter of the trickster, creator Coyote himself. But she had been banished from her people for a terrible crime, helping another witch hoard the life, giving salmon, disrupting the balance of the world. Her father, Coyote, in his anger, exiled her to the deep canyons of the Snake and Salmon rivers to live among the cave peoples. There, she learned a dark and terrible magic, a way to achieve a twisted form of immortality. To sustain her unnaturally long life, She needed to make sacrifices. She needed to lure people into the wilderness, into her domain. Especially during times of chaos, like storms and wildfires, which she could influence with her magic. I stared at the words, my mind reeling. It was insane. The stuff of campfire tales, but it explained everything. I flipped through the last few pages of the journal, which were filled with short, desperate entries. They read like a set of rules for survival. On July 12th, he wrote of rhythmic scratching on the west, facing glass, noting it was too deliberate for an animal. A few days later, an entry from 2 a.m. read, woke to see a woman standing at the tree line. Just standing, smiling. Turned on the main light, she was gone. On July 21st, he saw the big cat again, describing it as cougar, but black as pitch and twice the size of any I've seen. It watched the tower. By August 3rd, the terror was palpable. He wrote of hearing a woman humming through radio static, even when dispatch confirmed the channel was clear. It's the Pumwa, he wrote. The old man was right. The final entry, dated August 4th, was a chilling, self-directed command. She knows I'm here. She wants me to run. Rule 1, don't run. Never run. The journal ended there. There were no more entries. I sat in the silent cab, the weight of Harvey's story pressing down on me. I was no longer just a man struggling with isolation. I was the next chapter in a story that had been playing out on this mountain for years, perhaps centuries. I wasn't going crazy. The threat was real. As if on cue, a voice from below shattered the silence. Hello. Is anyone up there? I nearly jumped out of my skin. I scrambled to the window and looked down. At the base of the tower stood a young woman. She was dressed in hiking gear, with a large rucksack on her back. She had dark hair and a kind face. She looked like a silent native girl, maybe in her late teens or early 20s. Exactly as one of Harvey's contacts had described the Pumwa's human form. I think I'm lost, she called up, her voice pleasant. My GPS died. Could I get some water and maybe look at your map? My mind was a battlefield. Every instinct of human decency, every protocol of my job, screamed at me to help her. She looked harmless, exhausted. But Harvey's words echoed in my head. A woman, smiling. She looked up at me and smiled. It was a perfect, friendly smile, but seeing it after reading the journal, it felt like a mask stretched over something horrible. This was a test. It was a sophisticated, cruel trap, preying on my empathy. My refusal to help would feel like a monstrous act, yet helping her could be my last. I can't let you up. I called down, my voice hoarse. It's against regulations, but I can lower some water to you. Oh, she said, her smile not faltering. Okay. Thank you. My hands shook as I tied a full water bottle to my rope and lowered it down the side of the tower. It swung gently, landing on the ground a few feet from her. She watched it land. She looked up at me, her dark eyes unreadable. That terrible, fixed smile was still on her face. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back into the dense forest, disappearing into the shadows as if she were made of them. She never touched the water. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the untouched water bottle, swinging gently in the wind. a pendulum marking the seconds of my new, terrifying reality. The choice had been made for me. I was no longer just a lookout. I was a prisoner. The encounter with the woman, with the Pumwa, shattered the last remnants of my denial. The world was no longer divided into the rational and the irrational. There was only the horrifying truth of my situation. I was trapped 40 feet in the air, a solitary man in a glass box, being stalked by a creature from the darkest corners of Nez Perce legend. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into a watching shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. I clutched Harvey's journal like a holy text, rereading his desperate rules, trying to graft his experience onto my own. The sky began to reflect my inner turmoil. The clear blue Idaho sky I had come to love was swallowed by a bruised purple, gray mass of clouds rolling in from the west. Dispatch had been forecasting it all day, a major electrical storm system moving through the region. In my previous life, I would have found it beautiful. Now I knew it was a harbinger. The Pumwa was associated with storms. She didn't just appear in them, she used them. The storm wasn't just weather, it was an accomplice. As dusk fell, the first rumbles of thunder echoed through the canyons. The tower, my tiny metal and wood sanctuary, began to feel like the most dangerous place on Earth. I thought of the thick copper, grounding cables I'd inspected during my first week. Cables that snake it from the roof down, the steel legs and into the earth, designed to safely disperse a lightning strike. Now they felt like an invitation, a direct line from the storm's fury to me. I was sitting in a tiny metal box, on the highest point for miles, literally daring the lightning to strike. I was a beacon. The storm broke with a savage intensity. Rain hammered against the windows in horizontal sheets, and the wind howled with a freight train's fury. Lightning spider-webbed across the sky, each flash bleaching the world white for a split second, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the tower to its foundations. In those brief, brilliant flashes, I saw the forest below, a writhing, tormented landscape. And then the siege began. It started with the scratching, not the faint skittering of a pica or the deliberate scrape I'd heard before. This was a frantic, violent clawing at the glass, a sound like a bag of razors being dragged loud across the panes, loud enough to be heard, even over the roar of the storm. It moved from window to window, a circling, relentless assault. I huddled in the center of the room, away from the glass, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then came a deep, resonant THD from below, the sound of something heavy striking one of the tower's steel legs. It was followed by another and another, a percussive rhythm of pure malice. It was trying to shake me out, to test the integrity of my cage. A flash of lightning illuminated the catwalk, and my heart stopped. A face was pressed against the glass of the door. It was the hiker girl. Her eyes were wide and black, her smile stretched into a grotesque, inhuman grin. Her face was pale and slick with rain, and for a horrifying instant, the lightning seemed to show what was beneath the skin. A flicker of sharp teeth and hollowed out features, a monstrous death mask. I screamed, stumbling backward and falling over my chair. Before I could even process what I'd seen, a new sound began, the one I had been dreading most of all. A slow metallic clang. 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 It was climbing the stairs. The sound was heavy, deliberate. Not the white tread of a human, but the weighty impact of something powerful and determined. Its claws, or whatever it had, scraping against the metal steps with each upward movement. It was coming for me. The sanctity of my tower, my last refuge, was being violated. The verticality of the ascent was a unique form of terror. The threat was rising from the chaos below to claim my small bubble of order. Clang. Clang. Silang. It was getting faster, closer. It was halfway up. 3/4. Panic seized me, a cold, paralyzing wave. My mind was a blank wall of terror. Then, a single thought broke through. A line from Harvey's journal. Rule 30. She hates the main light. With a surge of desperate energy, I scrambled to my feet and lunged for the main switch by the door. It controlled the powerful exterior floodlights that illuminated the catwalk. I slammed my palm against it. 4 brilliant beams of light cut through the darkness, flooding the tower's exterior in a harsh, artificial glare. The climbing stopped instantly. Silence, save for the drumming of the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. I held my breath. My ear pressed against the door. Nothing. Cautiously, I crept to the window next to the door, the one where her face had been, and peered down at the staircase. My breath hitched in my throat. Crouched on the landing just below the trapdoor. Entrance to the cab was not a woman. It was a cougar. But it was a creature of nightmare. It was huge, far larger than any mountain lion I had ever seen pictures of. And its fur was the color of pitch, a void in the rain, soaked night. Its muscles bunched powerfully. And as it turned its head to look up, its eyes caught the floodlight and glowed with a sickening yellow, green fire. As I watched, frozen in horror, the air around it seemed to shimmer, to warp like heat haze. The creature's form began to flow and twist, the sleek, feline body elongated, the powerful limbs contorted. The black fur seemed to melt away, resolving into the pale skin and dark, wet clothes of the hiker girl. The transformation was fluid and sickeningly silent. She stood there on the landing, smiling that same terrible smile, the shapeshift confirmed. The last shred of doubt incinerated in a flash of pure horror. She was both things at once, the beautiful lure and the ravenous predator. She held my gaze for a long moment, then turned and descended the stairs, with an unnerving, graceful silence. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the floor, an axe in my hands, watching the storm slowly die down. The adrenaline gave way to a bone, deep exhaustion. But sleep was an impossible luxury. Just before dawn, as the sky was beginning to soften to a bruised gray, the radio crackled to life. It wasn't the familiar, tinny voice of dispatch. It was a woman's voice. Soft, melodic, and deeply unsettling. Jake. It whispered from the speaker. A sound that seemed to bypass my ears and slide directly into my brain. I know you're alone up there, Jake. Don't be afraid. It was her voice. The hiker, the Pumwat. It was using my lifeline, my only connection to the outside world, as a weapon. It's so cold out here, the voice cooed. a perfect imitation of human empathy. "Calm down. Let me in. I can help you escape all this. I can make the fear go away." The entity could mimic human speech, a detail no folklore had prepared me for. It was a violation so profound, so intimate, that something inside me snapped. With a guttural roar of rage and terror, I lunged at the radio, grabbing it and smashing it against the corner of my metal desk again and again. Plastic shattered. Wires sparked. I didn't stop until it was a mangled wreck of circuits and broken casing. I threw the ruined device into the corner and collapsed against the wall, my chest heavy. The silence that filled the cab was absolute. It was a silence of my own making. I had severed my last tie to the world. No one could call me. I could call no one. The process of isolation the creature had begun was now complete, and I was its architect. I was utterly, terrifyingly, and irrevocably alone. I survived the night. Survival, however, felt less like a victory and more like a temporary stay of execution. As the sun rose, it did not bring the clear, hopeful light of a new day. Instead, the dawn was a sickening, angry red, painting the eastern sky in hues of blood and fire. The air, thick and heavy after the storm, carried a new scent, the sharp, acrid smell of burning pine. I raised my binoculars to my aching eyes, my hands trembling so badly it was difficult to focus. And then I saw it. My blood turned to ice in my veins. A few miles to the northeast, in the exact same trackless canyon, where I had seen the phantom light days before, a column of thick, black smoke was churning into the sky. It wasn't a wisp. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a fire, a significant, growing wildfire. And I knew with a certainty that transcended logic and settled deep in my bones that she had started it. The Pumwa's connection to fire wasn't just folklore, it was a fact I was now witnessing firsthand. The storm had been the overture. This was the main act. The fire presented me with a paralyzing, impossible choice. My entire purpose for being on this mountain, the very reason for my existence in this last box, was to spot and report fires. It was my one and only job, my duty, ingrained in me by training and by my own engineering. Bred sense of responsibility screamed at me to act. I had a backup handheld radio. I could get on the horn, call it in, give them the coordinates from the Osborne Fire Funder, and be the calm, professional lookout. But Harvey's journal and the monstrous reality of the previous night told me it was a trap. The fire wasn't a natural disaster. It was a lure. It was a piece of bait cast with terrifying intelligence. I understood its horrifying purpose now. The fire was designed to do one of two things. Either it would force me, its primary target, out of the relative safety of the tower and into the woods where she was waiting, or, even more monstrously, it would lure firefighters into the wilderness. It would bring her a fresh harvest of victims, souls to sacrifice to sustain her unnatural life. I was caught in a perfect, diabolical machine. To do my job was to become an accomplice to murder. To remain silent was to betray my duty and let a massive fire rage unchecked through a national forest. The tools of my trade, the fire fender and the radio, which had once represented order and safety, now felt like instruments of damnation. Using them would be a capitulation, an act of feeding the beast. I stood before the fire finder, its brass ring gleaming in the red, tinned light. I could see the fire through its sights, a roiling, living thing. The smoke, as it billowed upwards, seemed to twist into unnatural shapes. For a moment, it looked like a vast, grasping hand reaching for the sky. The Pumwa had inverted the very purpose of my existence here. The fire lookout system was created to impose human order on the chaos of the wilderness. She was using that very system, that very logic against itself. She had created the disaster, and now she was waiting for the system's response, turning a tool of preservation into a beacon for slaughter. My choice wasn't just about my own life. It was about whether to activate the trap. As the morning wore on, the fire grew with terrifying speed, cresting a nearby ridge. The roar was a distant, constant hum, and the heat was a palpable presence on the air. I could not stay. The fire would eventually reach the tower, or she would return, emboldened, to finish what she started. I couldn't call for help, because that would mean leading others into this nightmare. My only option was to run. It was a desperate, suicidal gamble, but it was the only choice that didn't make me her accomplice. My movements were stiff, robotic. I shoved Harvey's journal into my pack. I filled my canteen with the last of my water. I grabbed the small hand axe from the floor. I took one last, sweeping look around the 14 by 14-foot cab that had been my entire world. My sanctuary, my prison, my tomb. Then, with a final, shuddering breath, I unbolted the trapdoor in the floor, swung my legs through the opening, and began my descent. Each step down the metal staircase was a conscious act of will. I was leaving my fortress and walking directly into her territory. The air grew thick with smoke, stinging my eyes and clogging my throat. The world below was an apocalyptic canvas of red light and shifting gray shadows. I knew she was out there, in the smoky wilderness, waiting for me. Perhaps my desperate flight could serve one last, tragic purpose to lead her away. To make myself the sole focus of her hunt, and to give any potential rescue crews a fighting chance. It was a sliver of hope, but it was all I had. I reached the bottom, my feet touching the soft earth, and without looking back, I ran. My name is Dr. Elias Thorne. For the past 15 years, the Appalachian Mountains have been more than just a landscape. They have been the very bedrock of my existence, my sanctuary, my sprawling outdoor laboratory, and increasingly a source of profound, unsettling torment. I am a lead wildlife biologist, a title I've worn with pride and unwavering dedication, specializing in the black bear populations that roam these ancient peaks, deep valleys, and winding river systems. My work is, by its very nature, meticulous, grounded in the cold, hard facts of data, the precise coordinates of GPS, and the unwavering discipline of scientific observation. I track migration patterns, monitor the health and reproductive cycles of these magnificent creatures, and strive to ensure the delicate, intricate balance of this vast, wild ecosystem remains undisturbed. It is a life of quiet purpose, of methodical inquiry, a life I believed I understood completely. But that understanding, that bedrock of certainty, has begun to fracture. Just moments ago, my gloved fingers, calloused and stained from years of field work, meticulously traced the deep, unnatural gouges on the ancient oak. This wasn't the work of a bear, not even the largest, most aggressive male. The marks were too clean, too precise, yet impossibly deep, as if carved by something with immense, focused power. A prickle of unease, sharp and insistent as a splinter beneath the skin, burrowed deep within me, a sensation utterly alien to my usual professional calm. It was the first discordant note in a symphony I had always known, a whisper of something fundamentally wrong in a world I thought I had mastered. A word count, 230 words. The Appalachian Mountains, in their raw, untamed grandeur, have always held a profound, almost spiritual allure for me. They are, as scientific studies and ancient lore alike describe them, one of the most climate-resilient, biologically diverse, and carbon-rich landscapes on Earth. I've spent countless seasons immersed in their embrace, from the mist-shrouded peaks that seem to touch the very clouds, to the deep, shadowed valleys where sunlight struggles to penetrate the dense canopy. The air here usually hums with life, the rustle of countless leaves underfoot, the distant, piercing call of a hawk circling high above, the subtle snap of twigs as unseen deer or smaller creatures move through the undergrowth. It's a symphony of nature, a constant, reassuring presence that speaks of life, of cycles, of predictable wildness. But lately, that symphony has been replaced by something else. A silence, a profound, unnerving quiet that feels less like peace and more like a held breath, a vast, empty space where sound should be. I remember the first time I truly noticed it. It was late autumn, the air crisp with the biting promise of winter, and the leaves were a riot of fiery reds, deep golds, and burnt oranges, a final, vibrant flourish before the cold sleep. I was tracking a mature female bear, designated Ursula 7, in our database whose GPS collar had suddenly gone silent. This, in itself, wasn't entirely unusual. Collars malfunction. Batteries die, or sometimes a bear simply sheds it. But Ursula 7 was a robust, healthy bear, well established in her territory, a creature of habit and predictable patterns. Her sudden, inexplicable disappearance felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong, as I pushed deeper into a particularly dense section of forest, where the ancient hemlocks stood shoulder to shoulder, their branches interwoven like a dark, protective ceiling. The familiar sounds of the woods began to recede. The incessant chirping of cicadas, the distant call of a crow, even the gentle murmur of the wind through the pines all faded, as if swallowed by an invisible void. My own ragged breath, usually a quiet, rhythmic companion to my footsteps, suddenly seemed deafening in the eerie stillness. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, a heavy blanket that smothers sound, making the hairs on your arms stand on end. A silence that screamed of absence rather than tranquility, a predatory quiet. I found Ursula 7's collar first, snagged on a low, hanging branch, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately. It was intact, the battery indicator still glowing faintly, a tiny, defiant green light in the encroaching gloom. Not a malfunction, then. My brow furrowed, a familiar gesture of concentration that now felt tinged with something akin to dread. I knelt, examining the ground around the branch. There were tracks, unmistakably Ursula 7's, deep impressions in the damp earth, clear and defined. But they ended abruptly, mid-stride, as if she had simply ceased to exist, vanished into thin air. No struggle, no drag marks, no torn earth, just nothing. My scientific mind, trained to seek logical explanations, immediately sought rationalizations: a sudden, swift predator, a rock slide. But the ground was undisturbed beyond her prints, and the ancient trees stood tall and unblemished, their bark unscarred. The only anomaly was a faint, acrid scent, like ozone mixed with something metallic, clinging to the air around the collar. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it pricked at my nose, alien to the familiar, comforting smells of damp earth, pine needles, and decaying leaves. It was the smell of something other. Over the next few weeks, the anomalies escalated with a chilling, relentless precision. More collars went silent. Not just one or two, but 5, then 8, then a dozen. Bears I had tracked for years. Bears whose habits I knew intimately. Bears that were the very subjects of my life's work, simply vanished. And then came the discoveries. The first carcass was a young male, barely 2 years old, a bear we had named Cubby, for his playful nature. I found him sprawled at the base of a towering hemlock, his body twisted into an impossible position, limbs splayed at unnatural angles, as if he had been violently wrenched apart by an invisible hand. There were no visible wounds, no signs of a struggle, no blood. It was as if he had been dropped from a great height, or perhaps violently contorted by an unseen, immense force. His eyes, wide and glassy, held an expression of extreme, unnatural terror, a silent scream frozen in death. My initial scientific rationalization, a rare disease, perhaps, or a freak accident, a fall from a cliff, began to crumble, dissolving like mist in the morning sun. This defied every known predator, every natural phenomenon, every scientific principle I had ever encountered in my career. The second carcass was even more disturbing, a discovery that chipped away at the very foundations of my sanity. It was a large male, known to us as Goliath, a bear whose sheer size and formidable presence usually deterred any would-be aggressors. I found him partially buried under a pile of freshly broken branches, deep in a ravine where no human or animal could have dragged them, let alone piled them with such deliberate, almost ritualistic precision. His thick, dark fur was matted, not with blood, but with a strange, viscous residue that shimmered faintly, almost iridescently. In the weak sunlight filtering through the canopy, it felt cold to the touch, despite the mild air. And then I saw the tracks. Not Goliath's, not a mountain lion's, not even a wolf's. These were large, bipedal impressions, almost human, like in their stride, but far too big, nearly 2 feet long and 8 inches wide. They were indistinct, as if the ground itself had tried to swallow them, blurring at the edges, but they were undeniably there. And they led away from the carcass, deeper into the impenetrable forest, where the silence was thick enough to taste a suffocating blanket that pressed down on me. I tried to explain it away. A rogue bear, perhaps, exhibiting unusual aggression. But the sheer power required to contort a bear like Cubby, or to move Goliath's massive body and bury him, was beyond any animal I knew. And the tracks, they were a puzzle I couldn't solve with my zoological training. My colleagues back at the research station, miles away and connected only by crackling satellite phone, offered theories anew. Aggressive strain of canine distemper, a particularly brutal territorial dispute, even poachers. I humored them, nodding along, offering vague agreements, but deep down, a cold, insidious dread was beginning to take root. The scientific explanations felt flimsy, inadequate, almost laughable against the growing weight of the inexplicable. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt under siege. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, colder. Even as the days remained mild, I started noticing localized cold spots, sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature that would sweep through a small area of the forest, leaving me shivering despite my layers of thermal gear. It was like walking through invisible currents of ice, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. And the sounds, they became more frequent, more unsettling, evolving from subtle disturbances to direct, yet still unseen, auditory cues. Not the clear, distinct sounds of wildlife, but low rumbles that vibrated through the soles of my boots, a deep, guttural hum that seemed to come from the very earth itself, resonating in my bones. Sometimes, I would hear what sounded like distant, indistinct footsteps, heavy and deliberate, always just out of sight, always just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. When night fell, they seemed to follow me, or perhaps to circle me. One evening, as dusk blotted into the deep, suffocating darkness of the Appalachian night, I was setting up a new camera trap near a known bear den, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was doing this. The wind, usually a gentle whisper through the trees, suddenly picked up, howling through the gaps in the ridges like a lonely, haunting voice. It carried with it not the comforting scent of pine or damp earth, but that same metallic tang, stronger now, almost overwhelming, burning in my nostrils. And then, through the mournful wail of the wind, I heard it. A sound that was undeniably a scream. Not human, not animal, but something else entirely. Something ancient and raw, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the night itself, ripping through the silence I had come to dread. It echoed through the valleys, chilling me to the bone, a primal shriek that spoke of unimaginable pain and terror. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ceased. The wind died, the metallic scent vanished, and the profound, unnatural silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drum against my ribs, a sound that seemed to fill the entire forest. I stood frozen, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife on my belt, a useless gesture against whatever had just made that sound. I spent the rest of that night huddled in my tent, the scream replaying in my mind, an endless loop of terror, every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, every distant hoot of an owl was amplified into a potential threat, a sign of its return. My scientific training, my years of logical deduction, offered no comfort, no explanation. There was no rational basis for what I had heard, for what I was seeing. The bears weren't just dying, they were being hunted. And whatever was hunting them was not of this world, or at least, not of the world I knew. The Appalachian Mountains, once my haven, were slowly revealing a darker, more predatory nature. The breathtaking beauty was still there, but it was now irrevocably tinged with a pervasive sense of dread, a foreboding that whispered of ancient evils stirring in the deep woods. I was no longer just a biologist tracking bears. I was a man caught in a nightmare. And the hunt, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach, had just begun. The scream I heard that night, echoing through the Appalachian valleys, was a sound that burrowed deep into my psyche and refused to leave. It wasn't the shriek of a dying animal, nor the cry of a lost human. It was something primal, ancient, and utterly devoid of anything recognizable from the natural world I had dedicated my life to studying. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated terror, and it confirmed what my scientific mind had desperately tried to deny. Something was hunting the bears, and it was unlike anything I had ever known. My initial unease, a mere prickle of dread, had now deepened into a cold, knowing fear that settled in my bones. The days that followed blurred into a relentless cycle of tracking, discovery, and escalating dread. I pushed deeper into the wilderness, driven by a desperate need for answers, yet every step felt like a descent into a darker, more hostile version of the mountains I once loved. The silence, which had been unnerving in part one, now felt like a living, breathing entity, a suffocating presence that pressed in on me from all sides. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was an imposed silence, as if the very ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. The usual chirping of birds, the rustle of small creatures, the distant buzz of insects, all were gone, replaced by a profound, unnatural stillness that amplified every beat of my own frantic heart. The environment itself seemed to conspire against me, becoming an active participant in the unfolding horror. One afternoon, a thick, disorienting fog rolled in with unnatural speed, swallowing the familiar landscape whole. It wasn't a gentle mist, it was a dense, cloying blanket that muffled sound and reduced visibility to mere feet. The towering trees, once comforting sentinels, transformed into grotesque, shadowy figures, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers through the swirling vapor. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig became a potential threat, magnified by the oppressive quiet. I found myself spinning in circles, disoriented, my GPS unit struggling to get a clear signal through the thick atmospheric interference. The fog wasn't just a weather phenomenon. It felt like a deliberate act, a veil drawn by an unseen hand to conceal and confuse. I could feel the cold, damp tendrils of it against my skin, a clammy touch that made me shiver despite my heavy jacket. The bare kills became increasingly grotesque, defying any logical explanation. I found a young cub, its body meticulously dismembered, each limb placed in a perfect circle around its torso, almost like a macabre offering. There was no blood, no struggle, just the chilling precision of the arrangement. Another time, I stumbled upon a large male bear, impaled high on a broken tree trunk, its eyes still wide with terror, its fur singed in places as if by an intense, localized heat. The metallic, ozone-like scent, which I had first noticed around Ursula Seven's collar, was now stronger, almost burning my nostrils, a constant companion to these horrific discoveries. It was the smell of something unnatural, something that didn't belong in these ancient woods. The tracks, too, continued to haunt me. Those impossibly large, bipedal impressions, almost human, like but far too big, continued to appear near the kill sites. Sometimes they would simply vanish, as if the creature had taken flight or dissolved into the very air. Other times, they would lead to impossible places, up sheer rock faces, or into dense thickets where nothing of that size could possibly pass without leaving a trail of broken branches. I tried to cast molds to get a clearer impression, but the ground always seemed to shift, or the prints would blur, as if actively resisting my attempts to document them. It was as if the entity was deliberately toying with me, leaving just enough evidence to confirm its presence, but never enough to reveal its true form. The fear of the unknown, as Lovecraft so aptly put it, is the strongest kind of fear, and this entity was a master of it. Its terror was derived entirely from its impact, from the devastation it left behind, and from the horrifying blanks my own imagination was forced to fill. My nights became a torment. Sleep offered no escape, only vivid, recurring nightmares of the bear's deaths, their silent screams echoing in my mind. Even when awake, the auditory terror persisted. Low, frequency rumbles, like the grinding of colossal stones deep beneath the earth, would vibrate through the ground, rattling the very foundations of my tent and creating a profound sense of impending doom. I'd hear distinct, non-animalistic footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling my camp, always just out of sight, always just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. Sometimes, they would stop right outside my tent, and I would hold my breath, listening to the frantic pounding of my own heart, convinced that whatever was out there was just inches away, waiting. Then, a low growl, a sound that was too deep, too resonant to be any known predator, would reverberate through the trees, followed by an eerie screech that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the night. It was a sound that spoke of immense power and malevolent intent, a sound that made my blood run cold. I started talking to myself, whispering theories, trying to rationalize the irrational. It's a new species, I'd mutter, pacing my small tent. An undiscovered apex predator, highly intelligent, perhaps bipedal. But even as I spoke the words, they sounded hollow, flimsy. No known predator could do this. No animal could manipulate the environment, create such silence, or leave such bizarre, untraceable marks. My scientific training, once my greatest strength, was now my greatest weakness, unable to provide answers, leaving me adrift in a sea of terrifying possibilities. It was during one of these desperate, sleepless nights that the whispers of the mountains began to seep into my consciousness, not as scientific data, but as echoes of ancient fears. I remembered old tales, stories I'd dismissed as mere superstition, folklore passed down through generations of Appalachian inhabitants. My grandmother, a woman born and raised deep in these very mountains, used to tell me stories by the firelight, tales of things that lurked in the hollows and on the high ridges. She spoke of the moon-eyed people, ancient, nocturnal beings who lived in caves and could only see in the dark, driven from their homes by early settlers. She described them as pale, almost translucent, with large, glowing eyes. The thought of those eyes, watching me from the impenetrable darkness, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Then there were the stories of the wild man, a mythical figure, hairy and beast-like, living deep in the wilderness, a creature that resembled man but remained wild and elusive. It was a concept that aligned eerily with the bipedal tracks I'd found. Was this what I was tracking? A cryptid, a creature of legend, finally revealing itself in the most brutal way imaginable. The local park rangers, when I'd cautiously brought up the unusual bear deaths, had exchanged uneasy glances. One older ranger, a man named Silas, who had lived his entire life in these mountains, had simply shaken his head. "Some things, Dr. Thorne," he'd said, his voice low, "ain't meant to be found. These mountains, they got their own ways, their own secrets, things older than any of us." He'd then mumbled something about Bigfoot or Sasquatch, a large, hairy human-like creature known for its elusiveness and terrifying screams. He spoke of it not as a myth, but as a very real, very dangerous presence. I had always prided myself on my rational mind, my ability to separate fact from fiction. But out here, alone in the deepening shadow of the Appalachians, the lines were blurring. The strange, guttural hums I heard, the unearthly screams, the impossible tracks, the meticulously arranged carcasses, they all began to coalesce into a terrifying narrative that transcended scientific explanation. Was the entity deliberately mimicking these legends to sow confusion and despair, leveraging deeply ingrained fears? Or was it truly one of these ancient beings, a creature of folklore brought to horrifying life? The thought that the something was not just hiding in the fog, but that it controlled the fog, that the sudden silence was an imposed silence, a predatory quiet, began to take root in my mind. It elevated the threat from a physical creature to a force with environmental control, making it far more powerful and inescapable. My isolation became a palpable thing, a suffocating weight. I was miles from any human settlement, my satellite phone's battery dwindling, its signal increasingly unreliable. The dense forests, once a comfort, now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap me, every tree a potential hiding place for the unseen hunter. The pervasive fog, the profound silence of the night, the mournful sound of the wind, they were no longer just natural elements. They were instruments of the entity, disorienting me, concealing its movements, amplifying my terror. I felt like a fly caught in a spider's web, every struggle only tightening the silken threads around me. I started seeing things in the periphery of my vision, fleeting shadows that darted between trees, distortions in the air that seemed to shimmer and then vanish. My mind, exhausted and frayed by constant fear and lack of sleep, was beginning to play tricks on me. Or was it? The line between objective reality and subjective terror was becoming increasingly thin. I found myself jumping at my own shadow, flinching at the sound of a falling leaf. The paranoia was a living thing inside me, feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every unexplained anomaly. One evening, as I huddled by a meager fire, trying to ward off the encroaching cold and the deeper chill in my soul, I heard it again. Not the scream this time, but a low, rhythmic thumping, like a massive heartbeat, vibrating through the earth beneath me. Thump, 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 thump. It was slow, deliberate, and it was getting closer. I extinguished my fire, plunging myself into absolute darkness, my hand gripping my hunting knife so tightly my knuckles ached. The thumping continued, circling my camp, closer now, accompanied by the faint, acrid smell. I could feel the vibrations in my chest, a terrifying echo of my own pounding heart. Then a branch snapped, impossibly loud, just feet from my tent. I heard a heavy exhalation, a sound like a great beast sighing, and then a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a sound that spoke of immense power, of ancient hunger. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing myself against the cold, damp earth, praying for dawn, praying for an end to this nightmare. But deep down, I knew. This was only the beginning. The mountains had awakened, and they were hungry. The rhythmic thumping that had circled my camp, the heavy exhalation, the guttural growl, they had been the final, brutal blows to my scientific composure. I had spent the rest of that night pressed against the cold, damp earth of my tent, every muscle rigid, every nerve screaming. My mind, usually a fortress of logic and reason, felt like a shattered pane of glass, reflecting 1,000 distorted fears. When the first sliver of dawn finally pierced the dense canopy, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays, I didn't feel relief. Only a profound, bone, deep exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue, settling into the very marrow of my being. I was no longer just tired, I was hollowed out. The next morning, I packed my camp with trembling hands, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I tried to tell myself it was the cold, the lack of sleep, the sheer stress of the situation. But a new, insidious doubt had begun to fester. Was it me? Was I losing my mind out here, alone in this ancient, unforgiving wilderness? The thought was almost as terrifying as the unseen entity itself. I found myself replaying the events of the past weeks, searching for inconsistencies, for moments where my perception might have been skewed. Had Ursula Seven's collar truly been placed on that branch, or had it simply snagged there naturally, and my fear-addled brain had twisted the detail? Were Goliath's tracks truly bipedal, or was I seeing what I dreaded to see, interpreting blurred paw prints as something monstrously human-like? My internal monologue, once a clear, analytical stream, had become a chaotic torrent of questions and self-doubt. It's the isolation, Elias. I'd whisper to myself, my voice hoarse, barely audible above the rustle of my own movements. The the lack of human contact. You're projecting. You're seeing monsters where there are only shadows. But then, the memory of that scream, that unearthly shriek that had torn through the night, would resurface, sharp and undeniable, cutting through my rationalizations like a knife. No animal made that sound. No human could. The hallucinations began subtly, a fleeting shadow darting between trees. Just at the edge of my peripheral vision, too quick to be real, too distinct to be nothing. I'd spin around, my heart leaping into my throat, only to find nothing but the familiar, indifferent forest. The trees themselves seemed to shift, their ancient, gnarled branches twisting into grotesque, accusing faces, their shadows lengthening and deepening into predatory forms. I knew, intellectually, that it was my mind playing tricks, a desperate attempt to make sense of the incomprehensible. But knowing didn't make it less real. The fear was no longer just out there, it was in here, a parasitic growth feeding on my sanity. My satellite phone, my last tenuous link to the outside world, finally died. The battery, already dwindling, gave up the ghost with a pathetic whimper, leaving me utterly cut off. No calls for help, no way to report my findings, no one to confirm that what I was experiencing was real. The silence that followed its demise was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on me, amplifying my vulnerability. I was truly alone now, trapped in a vast, green labyrinth with an unseen hunter. I started making irrational decisions. Instead of retreating, instead of seeking a way out, I pushed deeper. A desperate, almost manic compulsion drove me. I needed to find it. I needed to see it. I needed to understand. My scientific rigor had been replaced by a primal, obsessive need for answers, a need that bordered on madness. I abandoned established protocols, venturing into areas I knew were dangerous, ignoring the dwindling supplies in my pack. My physical state mirrored my mental decline. I was gaunt, my eyes sunken, and bloodshot from chronic sleep deprivation. Every muscle ached, every joint screamed in protest, but I pushed on, fueled by a frantic, desperate energy. The folklore I had dismissed as mere superstition now consumed my thoughts. The moon-eyed people, those ancient, nocturnal beings with their glowing eyes, driven from their homes by early settlers. The wild man, a hairy, beast-like figure, resembling man but remaining wild and elusive. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Nobi, Boojum, the names echoed in my mind, each one a terrifying possibility. Was this creature, this thing that hunted the bears, one of them? Or was it something else entirely? Something that merely mimicked these legends, twisting familiar fears into a new, incomprehensible horror. I remembered Silas, the old park ranger. His words about things older than any of us in these mountains. He had spoken of the brown mountain lights, eerie glowing orbs that hovered in the sky, attributed by some to the ghosts of grieving women, or even UFOs. What if the metallic scent, the localized cold spots, the disorienting fog, what if these weren't just environmental cues, but manifestations of the entity itself? What if it wasn't just hiding in the fog, but was the fog a shapeless, malevolent presence that could manipulate the very air around me? The thought was chilling, suggesting a power far beyond any physical creature. A force deeply intertwined with the ancient essence of the mountains themselves. One afternoon, I stumbled upon a clearing I had never seen before. Despite years of traversing this region, it was unnaturally circular, the trees around its perimeter stripped bare of bark, their wood blackened as if by fire. Yet there was no ash, no char. In the center, a single, massive black bear carcass lay splayed, its body meticulously arranged, its limbs pointing to the cardinal directions. It was a ritualistic display, a macabre altar. And then I saw it. Not the creature itself, not a clear, defined form, but a distortion in the air above the carcass. A shimmering, heat haze effect, like looking through warped glass, but in the cold, still air. It pulsed faintly, a barely perceptible ripple in the light, and from it emanated that cloying, metallic scent, stronger than ever, almost suffocating. My breath hitched. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. I raised my camera, my hands shaking violently, trying to capture the distortion, to prove what I was seeing. But the lens refused to focus, blurring the image into an indistinct smear. As I lowered the camera, the shimmering intensified, and a sound began to emanate from it, a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the ground, through my very bones, a sound that was both deeply ancient and utterly alien. It was the same low rumble I had heard circling my tent, but now it was amplified, a direct assault on my senses. And then, a voice. Not a voice I heard with my ears, but one that resonated directly in my mind, a cold, ancient whisper that bypassed my auditory nerves and burrowed straight into my consciousness. It was a chorus of whispers, 1,000 voices speaking as one, yet each distinct, each filled with an unimaginable hunger. You seek, you seek, you seek what cannot be known. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a creature. This was something else. Something that could speak directly into my thoughts. Something that had been toying with me, leading me deeper into its domain. The distortion in the air pulsed again, and for a fleeting, horrifying moment, I saw it. Not a full form, but a glimpse, a terrifying impressions, immense, shadowy, with eyes that glowed with an ancient, malevolent light, eyes that were too large, too knowing, eyes that seemed to absorb all light, all hope. They were the moon-eyed people's eyes, but twisted, magnified, filled with an intelligence that transcended human comprehension. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just hunting bears. It had been hunting me. From the moment Ursula Seven's collar went silent, from the first unnatural silence, it had been a game. A slow, methodical psychological siege designed to break me, to drive me to this very spot, to this terrifying, undeniable confrontation. The anomalies, the sounds, the vanishing tracks, the twisted carcasses, they were all part of its design, a macabre breadcrumb trail leading me to my own unraveling. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, falling hard onto the damp earth. The whispers intensified, swirling around me, a cacophony of ancient hunger and chilling amusement. You are ours, the mountains claim you. The metallic scent became unbearable, burning my lungs, making my head swim. I tried to crawl away, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if the very air had turned to lead. The distortion in the clearing pulsed one last time, brighter, more intense, and then, with a soundless implosion, it vanished. The metallic scent dissipated, the hum ceased, and the clearing was once again silent, save for the frantic, ragged gasps of my own breath. But the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of those whispers, the lingering image of those glowing, ancient eyes. I was still alive, physically, but something fundamental had broken inside me. My sanity, my scientific certainty, my very perception of reality, they had shattered. The something remained unseen. Its true form a horrifying mystery, but its presence, its power, and its malevolent intent were irrevocably confirmed. The climax wasn't a fight for survival, it was a battle for my mind, and I had lost. I was trapped, not just in the Appalachian wilderness, but within the confines of my own fractured consciousness, forever haunted by the unknowable entity that now claimed these mountains, and perhaps, a piece of me. The clearing, where the distortion had pulsed and the ancient whispers had burrowed into my mind, was now silent once more. The metallic scent, which had burned my lungs, had dissipated, leaving only the familiar, earthy smell of damp leaves and pine. But the silence was no longer a mere absence of sound. It was a vast, echoing chamber, filled with the phantom whispers of that ancient voice, the lingering image of those glowing, malevolent eyes. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, sprawled on the cold, damp earth, my body trembling uncontrollably, not from cold, but from a terror that had irrevocably shattered my very core. My scientific certainty, my carefully constructed reality, had imploded. I was alive, physically, but the man who had entered these mountains, Dr. Elias Thorne, the meticulous wildlife biologist, was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out shell, a mind irrevocably scarred. The immediate aftermath was a blur of primal instinct. I don't remember consciously deciding to move, only the desperate, animalistic urge to escape that clearing, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the place where my sanity had fractured. My limbs, heavy and unresponsive moments before, now moved with a jerky, almost frantic energy. I stumbled through the dense undergrowth, ignoring the sharp branches that tore at my clothes and scraped against my skin. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. Every distant hoot of an owl transformed into a mocking, guttural growl. The paranoia was a living thing inside me, a venomous serpent coiling around my thoughts, whispering doubts and horrors. I walked for what felt like days, though it might have been only hours. Time had ceased to have meaning. My compass, once a trusted tool, now seemed to spin erratically, its needle dancing with a life of its own. I questioned every direction, every landmark. Was I truly heading east, towards the distant, faint glow of civilization? Or was I merely circling, trapped in some invisible, malevolent loop? My dwindling supplies were forgotten. Hunger and thirst were distant concepts, overshadowed by the gnawing, relentless fear. My physical deterioration was stark. My face was gaunt, my eyes sunken and bloodshot, my once neat beard matted with sweat and grime. I moved like a ghost, a wraith haunted by unseen horrors, my own ragged breath the only constant in a world that had become utterly alien. The hallucinations intensified, bleeding seamlessly into my waking hours. I saw Ursula 7, her body whole, her eyes wide with terror, standing silently among the trees, watching me. I saw Goliath, impaled on a phantom tree trunk, his fur shimmering with that viscous, iridescent residue. The moon-eyed people, their immense, glowing eyes fixed on me, seemed to peer from behind every ancient hemlock, their pale forms shifting in the dappled light. I would flinch, cry out, stumble, only to find nothing there. Just the indifferent trees, the oppressive silence, and the chilling certainty that they had been there, that I had seen them. My mind was a battlefield, and the enemy was both within and without. Eventually, by some miracle or cruel twist of fate, I stumbled out of the deep wilderness. The transition was jarring, a violent wrenching from one reality to another. The first sign was the faint, distant hum of a vehicle, a sound that, for a moment, I mistook for the entity's low rumble. Then, the faint scent of wood smoke, followed by the sight of a narrow, unpaved road. I emerged onto it, blinking in the harsh, unfiltered sunlight, a wild, disheveled figure, my clothes torn, my face streaked with dirt and tears. A few hours later, a beat-up pickup truck, driven by a grizzled local hunter, found me. He stopped, his eyes widening at my appearance. "Doc Thorne," he rasped, his voice laced with disbelief. "What in God's name happened to you?" I tried to speak, to explain. I opened my mouth, but the words caught in my throat, tangled and meaningless. How could I describe the silence that swallowed sound, the tracks that defied logic, the screams that tore at the fabric of reality, the whispers that spoke directly into my mind? How could I explain the entity that was not seen, but felt? A malevolent force that manipulated the very environment. I tried to articulate the ritualistic bear kills, the glowing eyes, the sense of being hunted, but it came out as a jumbled, incoherent stream of frantic whispers and desperate gestures. The hunter, his face a mask of pity and concern, simply nodded slowly. "Rough time out there, hot dog. The mountains, they can do that to a man." He helped me into his truck, his touch gentle, as if I were a fragile, broken thing. He drove me to the nearest ranger station, a small, familiar cabin that now felt impossibly distant, impossibly safe. At the station, the rangers, my former colleagues, greeted me with a mixture of relief and profound concern. They listened patiently as I tried, again, to recount my experiences. I spoke of the vanishing bears, the impossible tracks, the pervasive cold spots, the unearthly screams. I even tried to describe the distortion in the clearing, the whispers, the glowing eyes. They exchanged uneasy glances, their faces reflecting a shared, unspoken understanding. They attributed my state to extreme stress, prolonged isolation, and perhaps a touch of hypothermia. They spoke of mountain fever, a colloquial term for the psychological toll the deep wilderness could take. They offered me food, water, a warm bed, and the quiet, sympathetic dismissal of my terrifying truth. "We'll send a team out," Elias, the head ranger, a kind woman named Sarah, said, her voice soft, almost a lullaby. "We'll check the coordinates you gave us, but you need rest. You've been through a lot." I knew they wouldn't find anything. Not the way I had. The entity, whatever it was, had retreated. It had played its game, broken its prey, and now it had returned to the shadows, waiting. The mountains, ancient and indifferent, would reclaim their secrets. The bear carcasses would decompose. The strange residue would wash away with the rain, and the impossible tracks would be erased by the wind and the passage of time. My story would become just another one of the Appalachian legends, whispered around campfires, dismissed as the ramblings of a man broken by the wilderness. I left the Appalachians a few days later, a ghost of my former self. The world outside the mountains felt too bright, too loud, too normal. The constant hum of traffic, the chatter of people, the artificial lights, they grated on my frayed nerves. I tried to return to my old life, to my research, but the numbers on the spreadsheets seemed meaningless, the scientific papers hollow. Every shadow held a potential threat, every sudden sound made me flinch. Sleep remained elusive, haunted by vivid nightmares of glowing eyes and ancient whispers. The fear of the unknown, Lovecraft had written, is the oldest and strongest kind of fear. And that fear, for me, was no longer an abstract concept. It was a living, breathing entity, permanently etched into the very fabric of my being. The entity in the Appalachians had not been defeated. It had simply withdrawn, its existence irrevocably confirmed in the shattered landscape of my mind. It had shown me that there are forces in this world, ancient and primordial, that defy all scientific understanding, forces that can break a man not with physical violence, but with the insidious erosion of his sanity. Sometimes, late at night, when the world outside my small apartment is quiet, I hear it. A low, guttural hum, vibrating through the floorboards, a sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. And I know it's not just in my head. It's an echo, a lingering presence, a reminder that the mountains hold secrets far older and far more terrifying than any legend. The bears are still out there, and so is the hunter, and I, Dr. Elias Thorne, am now just another voice in the vast, unsettling tapestry of Appalachian dread, a living testament to the unspeakable things that lurk in the shadows, waiting. The nightmare, I realize, never truly ends. It simply changes its form, becoming a permanent part of who you are. My name is Alara Vance, and I am a cartographer by trade, though my true passion lies in the quiet, untamed corners of the world. For years, my work has been a meticulous dance between the tangible and the unseen, translating the contours of the earth into lines and symbols, always seeking the hidden narratives etched into the landscape. My expeditions, often solitary, are less about conquest and more about communion. A deep, almost spiritual engagement with the wild. I am a woman of 32, with a pragmatic mind honed by years of scientific discipline, yet possessing an artist's eye for the sublime and the subtly unsettling. My hair, a practical, dark braid, often escapes in wisps around my face, a testament to hours spent outdoors, exposed to wind and sun. My hands, though capable of delicate precision with a compass and pen, bear the caluses of rock climbing and trail blazing. I seek patterns, order, and the logic of the natural world, a pursuit that has, until now, always offered a comforting sense of control. This journey into the ancient redwood forests of Northern California was meant to be another such endeavor, a mapping of forgotten trails, a quiet escape into the grandeur of giants. It was meant to be a sanctuary. It became anything but. The air, even at dawn, hung heavy and damp, carrying the rich, cloying scent of decaying wood, wet earth, and the sharp, clean tang of pine. It was a smell unique to these ancient groves, a primal perfume that promised both life and an unfathomable depth of time. My boots, already slick with dew, crunched softly on a carpet of fallen needles and moss as I stepped onto the trailhead. The silence was immediate, profound, and almost physical, a thick blanket woven from the absence of wind and the muffling embrace of the towering redwoods. These weren't just trees, they were colossal, living monuments, their trunks rising like fluted columns into a perpetual twilight, even as the sun began its slow ascent above the distant peaks. Sunlight, when it managed to pierce the dense canopy, fractured into ethereal shafts, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the humid air, creating an almost sacred, cathedral-like atmosphere. This was my comfort zone, my sanctuary, a place where the vastness of nature dwarfed human concerns into insignificance. I adjusted the straps of my pack, the familiar weight a reassuring presence against my shoulders, and began my trek deeper into the emerald heart of the forest. My initial objective was straightforward: to survey a series of old logging roads and game trails that had long since been reclaimed by the relentless growth of the forest. My map, a detailed topographical sheet I'd painstakingly annotated, showed a network of faint, dashed lines, hinting at paths less traveled, perhaps even forgotten. I preferred these ghost trails, where the whispers of the past mingled with the vibrant pulse of the present. The first few hours passed in a rhythm of quiet observation. I noted the intricate patterns of ferns unfurling, the vibrant splash of fungi on fallen logs, the occasional flash of a Steller's jay, its raucous call a brief punctuation in the pervasive quiet. The fog, a constant companion in this region, began to thicken, not as a dense, blinding wall, but as a soft, ethereal mist that clung to the undergrowth and softened the edges of the colossal trees. It was the kind of fog that made the world feel smaller, more intimate, yet also subtly disorienting. blurring the familiar into something slightly alien. The constant fog drip from the canopy became a pervasive auditory backdrop, a soft, rhythmic patter that, in the deepening silence, began to take on an unsettling quality, like slow, deliberate footsteps moving just beyond my sight. Around midday, I veered off the main, barely discernible trail, following a particularly faint line on my map that promised a shortcut through a less explored section of old growth. This was where the true work began, where the forest truly asserted its wildness. The undergrowth grew thicker, the ground softer and spongier with accumulated organic matter, muffling my footsteps until I felt like a phantom moving through a silent world. The light grew dimmer still, the perpetual twilight of the redwoods deepening into something akin to dusk, even though my watch insisted it was barely noon. It was here, amidst a particularly dense cluster of ancient redwoods, that I encountered the first anomaly. It wasn't a sound or a sight, but a feeling, a sudden, profound drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the ambient fog. It was as if I had stepped into a pocket of absolute cold, a chill that seeped into my bones despite my layers. My breath plumed in front of me, a stark white against the deep greens and browns of the forest. I stopped, my hand instinctively going to the compass clipped to my pack strap. The needle, usually a steady, reliable guide, was spinning wildly, erratically, as if caught in an invisible magnetic storm. I frowned, tapping the casing. It was a high-quality instrument, never failed me before. I tried to rationalize it, perhaps a localized magnetic anomaly, some strange mineral deposit beneath the earth, but the cold persisted, a silent, unnatural presence. Then I saw it, etched into the bark of a colossal redwood. Too high to be easily reached by human hands, was a symbol. It wasn't graffiti, nor was it a natural marking. It was a series of interlocking geometric shapes, precise and unnervingly symmetrical, yet utterly alien. It looked almost like a brand, burned into the ancient wood, though there was no charring, no visible damage beyond the symbol itself. It pulsed faintly, or perhaps it was just the trick of the dim light and my straining eyes, a subtle, almost imperceptible shimmer that made my skin prickle. My pragmatic mind immediately sought explanations. A prank, an elaborate piece of land art, but the sheer scale of the tree, the height of the mark, and the unsettling precision of the symbol defied easy answers. This wasn't a casual carving. It felt deliberate, ancient and deeply out of place. I reached out, my fingers hovering inches from the bark. The cold intensified, radiating from the symbol itself, a palpable chill that felt less like temperature and more like a draining of warmth, of life. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the air, a low thrumming that I felt more in my teeth than heard with my ears. It was then that the silence, which had been a comforting presence, twisted into something menacing. The usual forest sounds, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant call of birds, the gentle sway of branches, were utterly absent. Only the rhythmic, unsettling, fog, drip continued, now sounding less like water and more like something else. Something heavy and deliberate, moving just beyond the veil of mist. A primal instinct screamed at me to turn back, to dismiss this as a trick of the light, a momentary malfunction of my equipment, a product of my own solitude. But the cartographer in me, the part that sought to understand, to map the unknown, compelled me forward. This symbol, this inexplicable cold, this unnatural silence, it was a deviation, an anomaly that demanded investigation. My curiosity, a trait that had always served me well, now felt like a dangerous lure. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning in my lungs, and adjusted my grip on my hiking poles. The path ahead, barely visible through the thickening fog, seemed to beckon, promising answers, or perhaps only deeper questions. I knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in my gut, that I was no longer just mapping trails. I was stepping onto a path that shouldn't exist. The ordinary world, my comfort zone, was already a distant memory, a mirage dissolving behind me. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt like a vast, silent maw slowly closing around me. As I continued, the air grew heavier, the dampness clinging to my clothes and hair like a second skin. The spongy ground beneath my boots seemed to absorb all sound, creating an unnerving quiet that amplified every beat of my own heart. The redwoods, once majestic and awe-inspiring, now felt oppressive, their sheer scale creating a sense of claustrophobia despite the open air. Their dark, rough bark seemed to watch me, and the deep shadows they cast stretched and wreathed with an unsettling life of their own. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, a prickle of unease crawling up my spine, a feeling that I was being observed by something unseen. It was a sensation I couldn't rationalize, a purely instinctual dread that whispered of eyes in the perpetual twilight. The fog, which had been a gentle companion, now felt like an active participant in the growing strangeness. It swirled and shifted, obscuring my vision, making the familiar trees appear and disappear with disorienting ease. A particularly dense bank of mist ahead seemed to swallow the path whole, transforming the forest into a labyrinth of shifting gray. I hesitated, my hand tightening on my compass, which still spun erratically. My scientific mind fought against the rising tide of irrational fear. It's just fog, Alara. It's just a magnetic anomaly. There's a logical explanation for everything. But the words felt hollow, a desperate mantra against the undeniable chill that permeated everything. I pushed through the thickest part of the fog, my visibility reduced to mere feet. The fog drip intensified, a relentless, rhythmic patter that now sounded less like water and more like a deliberate, heavy tread, always just out of sight, always just beyond the reach of my straining ears. It was a sound that seemed to follow me, a phantom presence moving in tandem with my own steps. I tried to quicken my pace, but the uneven terrain and the clinging mist made it difficult. My breath came in ragged gasps, not from exertion, but from a growing, suffocating dread. Suddenly, a flash of movement at the very edge of my peripheral vision. A tall, dark shape, indistinct against the gray, seemed to phase in and out of existence within the fog. It was gone before I could fully turn my head, leaving behind only a lingering impression of impossible height and an unsettling stillness. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. I stopped dead, straining my eyes, trying to pierce the veil of mist. Nothing. Only the endless, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. Was it a trick of the light? A branch swaying in a non-existent breeze? Or had I finally seen a glimpse of the something that was making this forest feel so wrong? My mind raced, trying to reconcile the inexplicable with my ordered world. I was a cartographer, a woman who dealt in facts, in measurable distances and tangible landmarks. Yet, everything around me was defying logic. The compass, the cold, the symbol, the silence, the fleeting shadow. They were all pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit into any known framework. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, despite the chill in the air. This wasn't just a hike anymore. This was an intrusion, a trespass into something ancient and profoundly unsettling. The forest, which had always been a source of peace, now felt like a living, malevolent entity, slowly revealing its true, terrifying nature. I was no longer an observer, I was a participant. drawn into a narrative far older and darker than any map could ever depict. The path ahead, once merely a shortcut, now felt like an irreversible descent into the unknown, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that there was no turning back. My curiosity had not just pulled me in, it had trapped me. The symbol on the redwood, the inexplicable cold, the erratic compass, and the profound, unnatural silence, these anomalies had shattered the comforting illusion of my ordered world. My cartographer's mind, trained to find logic in every contour and coordinate, wrestled with the raw, visceral fear that now pulsed beneath my skin. I tried to rationalize, to dismiss it as a confluence of rare natural phenomena, a localized magnetic field, a sudden cold front, an optical illusion in the fog. But the sheer wrongness of it, the way the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, defied every scientific explanation I could conjure. My curiosity, once a guiding star, had become a dangerous current, pulling me deeper into the heart of the unknown. I pressed on, my hiking poles now less tools for navigation and more like extensions of a desperate need to understand, to quantify the unquantifiable. The path, if it could still be called that, grew increasingly indistinct, swallowed by the encroaching undergrowth and the pervasive mist. The towering redwoods, once symbols of ancient majesty, now felt like silent, watchful sentinels, their immense trunks forming a claustrophobic labyrinth. The fog drip continued, a relentless, rhythmic patter that had morphed from a mere environmental sound into something insidious, a constant reminder of an unseen presence. It was no longer just water. It was a cadence, a slow, deliberate thump. Thump, thump that seemed to echo the frantic beat of my own heart. I found myself constantly scanning the shifting gray veil, my eyes aching from the strain, desperate for a glimpse of whatever was moving just beyond my perception. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every gnarled root to twist into an unsettling shape. The air, heavy with the scent of damp soil and decaying wood, now carried a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or stagnant water, a smell that prickled at the back of my throat and made my stomach clench. Hours bled into an indistinguishable stretch of time. My sense of direction, usually infallible, began to fray. The compass remained useless, its needle spinning a frantic, meaningless dance. My GPS, too, flickered erratically, losing signal in the dense canopy, then briefly regaining it, only to display coordinates that made no sense, placing me miles from where I knew I should be. It was as if the very fabric of space was warping around me. I tried to retrace my steps, to follow the faint indentations my boots had left in the soft earth, but the fog seemed to erase them almost as quickly as I made them. The forest was actively disorienting me, turning its familiar grandeur into a weapon of confusion. The fleeting glimpses of movement became more frequent, more defined, yet never clear enough to confirm. A tall, dark shape, impossibly slender, would appear at the edge of my vision, only to vanish the instant I turned my head. Sometimes, it felt like a shadow detaching itself from a tree trunk, then melting back into the bark. Other times, it was a ripple in the fog itself, a disturbance in the air that suggested something massive yet unseen was passing through. My internal monologue, usually a calm, analytical stream of thought, devolved into a desperate argument with myself. It's fatigue, Alara. You're dehydrated. Your mind is playing tricks. There's no such thing as invisible giants. But the rationalizations felt increasingly flimsy, like a thin sheet of ice over a bottomless chasm. The fear was no longer a prickle. It was a cold, heavy weight settling in my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. I stumbled upon a clearing, or what appeared to be one, where the trees seemed to recede slightly, creating a circular space. In the center stood a cluster of stones, arranged in a pattern that was too deliberate to be natural. They were rough, hewn, ancient, and covered in moss, but their placement suggested a purpose, a design. My mind immediately flashed to the mystery walls I'd read about, enigmatic stone structures found in other parts of California, compared to crop circles or Stonehenge. These weren't walls, but they shared the same unsettling sense of ancient, unknown builders, of something placed here by hands that predated recorded history. As I approached, the cold intensified again, radiating from the stones themselves, a deeper, more profound chill than I had felt before. It was a cold that felt less like temperature and more like an absence, a void. A low, guttural sound, unlike anything I had ever heard in the wild, emanated from the center of the stone circle. It was a deep, resonant hum, almost a growl, that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. It wasn't the hum I'd felt near the symbol. This was deeper, more primal, filled with an ancient malevolence. My blood ran cold. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to run as fast as my legs could carry me, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. My eyes darted around the clearing, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but the fog swirled, thick and impenetrable, revealing nothing. The fog drip around the edges of the clearing seemed to quicken, a frantic, almost mocking rhythm. Then the air shimmered. Not a visual distortion, but a sensation like looking through heat haze, except it was cold. The stones in the center of the clearing seemed to ripple, their ancient surfaces momentarily blurring, as if the very fabric of reality was thinning. And through that shimmering, for a split second, I saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. A colossal indistinct form, darker than the deepest shadow, taller than any redwood, seemed to coalesce within the stone circle. It was immense, its outline vaguely humanoid, but stretched and distorted, its limbs too long, its head too small, or perhaps non-existent. It was a fleeting, terrifying glimpse, a shape that defied all natural laws. Something that truly shouldn't exist. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the shimmering air and the swirling fog, leaving behind only the lingering metallic scent and the profound, oppressive cold. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, landing hard on the damp earth. My pack dug into my back, but I barely registered the pain. My mind reeled, trying to process what I had just witnessed. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't fatigue. It was real, and it was here. The rational part of my brain, the part that had always sought logical explanations, shattered. This was beyond science, beyond maps, beyond anything I had ever encountered. This was the monster, the unknown or unknowable, that had been teasing me, hinting at its existence. And now, I had met it, however briefly, however indistinctly. A new, chilling realization dawned on me. This wasn't just a strange phenomenon I could observe and then leave behind. The symbol on the tree, the erratic compass, the pervasive cold, the disorienting fog, the fleeting glimpses, and now this was all connected. I wasn't just lost in the woods, I was trapped in them. The forest wasn't just a setting, it was an active participant, a living, breathing entity that was slowly, deliberately closing in. My initial curiosity had pulled me into a nightmare, and now there was no easy way back to the normal world. I was forced to start reacting to my new normal. The first plot point had arrived, and it was a terrifying, irreversible shift. My initial goal of mapping forgotten trails felt ludicrous, a naive pursuit in the face of this ancient, malevolent presence. The silence that followed the glimpse of the entity, was even more terrifying than the growl. It was an absolute, suffocating silence, devoid of even the fog, drip. It was the silence of a predator waiting. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles screaming in protest, but a new surge of adrenaline coursed through me. I had to move. I had to get out. But where? Every direction looked the same, a wall of shifting gray and towering, dark trees. My heart pounded, a frantic drum against the silence. My breath hitched in my throat. I was no longer just afraid. I was terrified, a primal bone, deep terror that stripped away all pretense of scientific detachment. The forest had claimed me, and the something within it was now fully aware of my presence. The game had changed. The glimpse of that colossal, indistinct form, darker than shadow, taller than any redwood, had ripped through the last vestiges of my scientific detachment. My rational mind, once my most trusted tool, lay shattered, replaced by a raw, primal terror. This wasn't a magnetic anomaly, or a trick of the light, or the product of fatigue. This was real. This was it. The something that shouldn't exist. And it was here, in these ancient woods, and it was aware of me. The silence that followed its brief manifestation was the most terrifying sound of all. The silence of a predator, waiting, watching. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat in the suffocating quiet. Every nerve ending screamed at me to run, to flee blindly, but where? Every direction was a wall of shifting gray, a labyrinth of towering, dark trees. My initial reaction was pure, unadulterated panic. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles screaming in protest, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. My eyes darted wildly, trying to pierce the swirling fog, desperate for any sign of an escape route, any familiar landmark. But the forest had become a living, breathing entity, actively working against me. The trees seemed to shift, their immense trunks blurring into an indistinguishable wall, the ground spongy and silent, offering no clear path. The fog, drip, which had briefly ceased, now resumed, a slow, deliberate thump, thump, thump that seemed to mock my terror, a constant reminder of the unseen presence that stalked me. The metallic tang in the air intensified, a cloying, coppery scent that made my stomach churn. I forced myself to breathe, to push back against the rising tide of hysteria. Think, Elara. You're a cartographer. You understand patterns. There has to be a pattern, a logic, even to this. But the logic was gone. The compass was still useless, spinning wildly. My GPS remained a dead weight, its screen stubbornly blank. I was utterly, irrevocably lost, not just geographically, but existentially. The comfort zone of my ordered world had been utterly obliterated, replaced by a nightmare reality where the laws of nature bent and broke. This was the midpoint, the moment of truth, where I realized that merely reacting, merely trying to escape, was no longer enough. This thing, whatever it was, had me, and if I was to survive, I had to understand it. I had to engage with it. This shift from passive victim to desperate investigator was born not of courage, but of a profound, chilling necessity. My original goals, mapping forgotten trails, finding quiet solitude, now seemed ludicrous, a naive pursuit in the face of this ancient, malevolent presence. The entity wasn't just a random occurrence, it felt deliberate, purposeful. It had drawn me in, and now it was revealing itself, piece by terrifying piece. I remembered the symbol on the redwood, its unnerving precision, its alien geometry. It wasn't a warning, it was a mark, a claim. I began to move again, not running, but walking with a grim determination. My eyes fixed on the shifting fog ahead. I was no longer trying to escape from it, but to move towards understanding it. I started talking to myself, a low, desperate murmur in the silence. trying to articulate the inexplicable, to force some semblance of order onto the chaos. "What are you? What do you want?" My voice sounded small, fragile, swallowed by the vastness of the ancient trees. The forest offered no answers, only the relentless fog drip and the oppressive weight of its unseen inhabitant. As I ventured deeper, the manifestations of the entity became more frequent, more audacious. The tall, dark shapes at the edge of my vision were no longer fleeting glimpses. They lingered, indistinct yet undeniably present, like colossal distortions in the very air. They moved with an impossible fluidity, phasing in and out of the dense fog, their forms never quite solidifying, yet their presence was a crushing weight on my senses. I felt a profound cold radiating from them, a cold that seemed to drain the warmth, not just from the air, but from my very soul. The metallic scent grew stronger, a cloying, sickly sweet odor that made my head ache. The forest itself seemed to respond to its presence. Trees that had stood firm moments before would suddenly appear gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The ground would ripple beneath my feet, not from an earthquake, but from some unseen force moving just below the surface. I saw ancient, moss-covered stones, similar to the ones in the clearing, appearing sporadically along my path, forming strange, incomplete patterns that hinted at a larger, terrifying design. It was as if the entity was actively reshaping the landscape around me, bending reality to its will. This was the confirmation phase, where the monster's presence was solidified, demonstrably gaining strength and a foothold. I could feel its power, an overwhelming, crushing force that made my own existence feel insignificant. My attempts to use my cartography skills to find some logical anchor became increasingly futile. I tried to map the anomalies, to plot the locations of the cold spots, the symbols, the shifting shadows. But the data was chaotic, nonsensical, defying any known geographical or physical laws. It was as if the forest itself was mocking my efforts, twisting the very concepts of space and direction. My scientific instruments, once my trusted companions, were now useless, silent witnesses to a reality they could not comprehend. This growing isolation, the severing of my connection to the rational world, was a direct manifestation of the horror itself. There was no one to call, no authority to convince, no scientific body that would believe my crazy ideas. I was utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. The dark night of the soul descended upon me with the deepening twilight. I found myself huddled beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient redwood, shivering uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from a profound, bone-deep despair. My attempts to understand, to fight back, had led me only deeper into the abyss. Every path I took seemed to lead back to the same unsettling patterns, the same chilling presence. All hope seemed lost. I had failed. I was lost, truly lost, in a world that had become alien and hostile. The entity's power felt absolute, its presence overwhelming. I articulated my fear in a desperate internal monologue, a silent scream against the suffocating silence. It's too big, too old. It's been here forever. It knows me. It wants something, but I don't know what. And I can't stop it. My mind replayed the fleeting glimpse of the entity, the impossible height, the indistinct, vaguely humanoid shape. It was a something that defied description, a creature of pure dread. I thought of the legends of Northern California, the Dark Watchers, giant human, like ghosts visible at twilight, staring at nothing visible, vanishing before your eyes. Or the walkers, invisible, tall creatures emitting radio static. This entity felt like a culmination of all those fears, a primal horror given form, or rather, formlessness. It was the unknown or unknowable, and its power was growing with every passing moment. The physical toll was immense. My body ached, my head throbbed, and a persistent, nauseating chill had settled deep in my bones. But it was the psychological torment that was truly breaking me. The constant uncertainty, the blurring of reality, the profound isolation, it was a systematic dismantling of my sanity. I was no longer just afraid for my life, I was afraid for my mind. The forest, once a source of comfort, had become a psychological prison, its ancient trees whispering promises of madness. As the last sliver of natural light faded, plunging the forest into an impenetrable darkness, the rhythmic fog drip seemed to intensify, becoming a relentless, mocking heartbeat. I could feel the presence now, closer than ever, a vast, cold shadow pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just observing, it was encroaching. My attempts to solve the problem, to find a way out, had met with unequivocal failure. I had reached my lowest point, genuinely believing I had truly lost. This was the nadir, the temporary defeat that felt absolute and inescapable. The internal and external conflicts had intensified dramatically, pushing me to my absolute breaking point. I was trapped, utterly at the mercy of the something that shouldn't exist, and the terrifying realization settled deep within me. The final conflict was inevitable. I was locked into it. The dark night of the soul had passed, leaving me hollowed out, yet strangely resolute. Huddled beneath the gnarled roots, the profound despair had given way to a cold, hard clarity. My attempts to escape, to rationalize, to simply survive, had failed. The entity, the something that shouldn't exist, had me. It had systematically stripped away my comfort, my logic, my very sanity. But in that absolute nadir, a new, desperate purpose began to coalesce. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't fight it physically. But perhaps, just perhaps, I could understand it. I could find a way to sever its hold, not on my body, but on my mind, on my reality. This was my new plan, born of desperation, a final, terrifying gamble. My body screamed in protest as I pushed myself upright. Every muscle ached. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, and the pervasive, unnatural cold had seeped into my very bones. But a strange, almost manic energy now coursed through me, a grim determination that transcended exhaustion. I was no longer just a cartographer lost in the woods. I was a survivor, a desperate explorer charting the contours of a nightmare. My eyes, once wide with terror, now narrowed, searching the swirling fog not for an escape, but for clues. The fog drip, that relentless, mocking rhythm, now felt like a countdown urging me forward. The metallic tang in the air, once nauseating, now seemed to sharpen my senses, a constant reminder of the entity's proximity. I began to move, slowly at first, then with a more deliberate pace, not following any discernible path, but drawn by an instinct I couldn't explain. It was as if the entity, in its relentless pursuit, had inadvertently laid out a breadcrumb trail of its own influence. I focused on the anomalies, the sudden drops in temperature, the areas where the fog seemed to thicken unnaturally, the subtle distortions in the air, the faint, low hum that vibrated through the earth. I was mapping its presence, not with a compass and GPS, but with my raw senses, my heightened fear. My internal monologue, once a desperate argument, became a focused, almost obsessive analysis. It feeds on fear. It distorts reality. It wants to isolate, to break connections. The thought was a chilling revelation, a personal truth that resonated with the systematic erosion of my own sanity and my increasing isolation. The forest responded to my shift in focus. The shadows seemed to deepen, coalescing into more defined, yet still indistinct, forms at the periphery of my vision. They were taller, more numerous, pressing in from all sides, their presence a crushing weight. The air grew heavy, thick with the metallic scent, and the cold intensified to an unbearable degree. A draining chill that felt like my very life force was being siphoned away. I could feel its immense power, its ancient malevolence, a force that had been here for millennia, perhaps since before these colossal redwoods first sprouted from the earth. It was the knowable, the something that defied all natural laws, and it was now making its undeniable presence known. I stumbled into another clearing, larger than the first, dominated by a single, impossibly ancient redwood. Its trunk was wider than any I had seen, its bark gnarled and twisted into grotesque, almost screaming faces, and etched into its surface, not just one, but dozens of the alien symbols, glowing with a faint, sickly luminescence. They pulsed in unison, a slow, rhythmic beat that mirrored the fog, drip, and the frantic pounding of my own heart. This was it. This was the heart of its domain, the nexus of its power. As I stepped into the clearing, the air shimmered violently, not just a heat haze, but a profound distortion of reality. The fog swirled, coalescing into a colossal, towering form directly in front of the ancient redwood. It was the entity, fully manifested, yet still indistinct, a shifting, undulating mass of pure shadow and impossible angles. It was immense, far taller than the tallest tree, its vaguely humanoid shape stretched and distorted, its limbs impossibly long, its head a featureless void. It was the Dark Watcher of legends, the Walker of whispers, a primal horror given terrifying, albeit fluid form. A sound emanated from it, not a growl, but a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the very ground, through my bones, through my teeth. It was the sound of pure static, a high level of radio waves that assaulted my ears, making my head ring. My mind screamed, trying to break, to flee into the comforting oblivion of madness. But I held on, clinging to that desperate resolve. It wants to sever connections. It wants to isolate. In that moment, a terrifying realization dawned on me. A personal revelation. That was the true horror. The entity wasn't just a monster in the woods. It was a manifestation of the woods, or rather, of the ancient, forgotten, and violated aspects of it. The logging, the desecration of ancient lands, the forgotten towns like Falk swallowed by the forest. It was a wound, and this entity was the infection, the primal scream of a violated wilderness. It fed on the fear of those who trespassed, those who disturbed the ancient balance. My fear, my isolation, my shattered sanity. It was its sustenance. The entity lunged, or rather, the space around it warped, and suddenly it was closer, its immense, cold presence suffocating me. I felt tendrils of pure dread reaching into my mind, trying to pry open the last defenses to consume my consciousness. I saw flashes of impossible landscapes, of ancient, forgotten rituals, of other victims, their faces contorted in silent screams. This was the climax, the final battle, not of physical strength, but of will, of mind. I closed my eyes, not in surrender, but in a desperate act of defiance. I focused on the one thing it couldn't take, my own internal landscape. I pictured my maps, the precise lines, the ordered contours, the tangible reality I had always known. I pictured the warmth of the sun, the sound of a normal breeze, the scent of a city street. I fought back with the very essence of what it sought to destroy: connection, order, the human spirit. I refused to be isolated. I refused to be consumed. I screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore from my throat, not of fear, but of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a scream that defied the silence, that shattered the illusion of its absolute power. The static shrieked, the cold intensified, and then, abruptly, it receded. The pressure eased. I opened my eyes. The entity was still there, a colossal, shifting shadow. But it was further away, its form less defined, as if my defiance had momentarily weakened its hold. The symbols on the tree still glowed, but their light seemed to flicker, less potent. The metallic scent began to dissipate, replaced by the damp, earthy smell of the forest. It hadn't been defeated, not truly, but it had been repelled. My will, my refusal to break, had been a weapon it hadn't anticipated. I stumbled out of the clearing, my legs shaking, my body trembling uncontrollably. The fog still clung to the trees, but it felt less menacing, more like a natural phenomenon. The fog drip was just water again. I walked, not knowing where I was going, but driven by an overwhelming need to put distance between myself and that ancient redwood. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and a strange, almost euphoric relief. Eventually, through a thinning of the trees, I saw at a faint, almost imperceptible trail leading towards what looked like a distant, hazy light. Civilization. I emerged from the forest days later, a ghost of my former self. My clothes were torn, my body covered in scratches and bruises, my face gaunt and streaked with dirt. The first people I encountered, a pair of park rangers, looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. I tried to tell them, to explain the cold, the symbols, the shifting shadows, the colossal entity. My words came out in a jumble, incoherent, the language of a mind that had seen too much. They nodded, their eyes filled with pity, attributing my state to exposure, dehydration, and the trauma of being lost. They didn't believe me. They couldn't. The threat is not acknowledged by the powers that be. I am back in my apartment now, surrounded by the familiar comforts of my ordered world. My compass works again, my GPS has signal, and the air is free of that cloying, metallic scent. But the forest, the something within it, is not gone. It lingers. In the quiet moments, I still feel the profound cold, hear the rhythmic fog drip that sounds like deliberate footsteps, see the shifting shadows at the edge of my vision. My sleep is haunted by glimpses of that colossal, indistinct form, its featureless void of a head. The world, once a place of measurable distances and tangible landmarks, is now permeated by an unsettling ambiguity. I know, with a chilling certainty, that there are more things in heaven and earth than my maps could ever depict. The redwoods still stand, ancient and majestic, but for me, they are forever tainted by the memory of what they conceal. The something is dormant, perhaps, but not vanquished. It waits, a primal force in the heart of the wilderness, ready to ensnare the next curious soul who dares to trespass. And I, Alara Vance, the cartographer who sought to map the unknown, am now a living testament to its existence, forever marked by the terror that shouldn't exist. The story doesn't end with a neat resolution. It ends with a lingering unease, a psychological residue that ensures the horror persists long after the final page. My name is Jack Colton. For the better part of 20 years, I've made my living in the quiet solitude of the northern Rocky Mountains. I'm a guide. When wealthy men from the cities want to feel the thrill of the wild, to track an elk through dense pine or face down a black bear, they call me. I know these mountains. I know their moods, their secrets, and their dangers. I've seen blizzards that can bury a cabin an hour in wildfires that can move faster than a panicked deer. I've faced down grizzlies and stared into the eyes of mountain lions. I say this not to boast, but to establish a simple fact. I am not a man who is easily frightened. But the man who called himself Arthur Blackwood was different. He wasn't like my usual clients. They came in brand new camouflage, smelling of money and ambition, their rifles gleaming and unused. Blackwood arrived at my remote cabin in a modest rental car, dressed in worn tweed and thick wool trousers, looking more like a university professor on a field trip than a hunter. He was a man in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard, spectacles perched on his nose, and the soft, pale hands of someone who had spent more time with books than with axes. He didn't carry a rifle. Instead, he had two large, reinforced Pelican cases, the kind you use for sensitive scientific equipment. His eyes, magnified by his glasses, held an intensity that was unsettling. It was a look of single-minded, almost fanatical purpose. "Mr. Colton," he said, his voice a dry academic baritone, "I was told you are the best, that you know the most remote parts of this range." "I know them well enough," I replied, leaning against my porch railing. "What are you looking to hunt?" "The elk season is promising this year." He gave a thin, dismissive smile. "I'm not interested in elk, Mr. Colton, or deer or bear." He paused, letting the silence hang in the crisp autumn air. "My quarry is more specific, and the location is non-negotiable." He unrolled a topographical map on my porch table. It was a detailed survey of the region, but his finger tapped on an area I hadn't guided anyone to in over a decade. It was a deep, isolated valley, a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by sheer, unforgiving cliffs on three sides. The old maps had a name for it, a name the locals still used in hushed tones: the Widow's Basin. It was a place with a history, a place where prospectors had vanished in the 1800s, where trappers were found driven mad by isolation, and where, even today, experienced hikers would get turned around and lost for weeks, only to be found miles from where they thought they were. The land itself was said to be wrong. Compasses spun uselessly, and the forest was unnaturally silent, devoid of the usual birdsong and animal chatter. It was a place you avoided. "Nobody goes into the basin," I said flatly. "There's nothing in there to hunt. The game avoids it. It's a dead zone." "Not dead," Blackwood corrected softly. "Just quiet. And that is precisely why I must go there." He looked up at me, his gaze unwavering. "I am prepared to pay you $10,000 for a one-week trip. 5,000 now, 5,000 upon our return." I stared at him. $10,000 was more than I made in a good season. It was enough to fix my leaky roof, buy a new truck, and live comfortably for a year. It was a stupid amount of money for a week's work. And that's what made me nervous. Desperate men and foolish men overpay. Blackwood seemed to be neither. He was something else. "For that price," I said slowly, "I deserve to know what we're hunting." He hesitated, choosing his words with care. "Let's call it a study of a persistent, localized predatory phenomenon," he said. "I am a researcher, Mr. Colton. A cryptozoologist, if you must have a label. I believe something unique resides in that basin, and I intend to document it." "Cryptozoologist? A Bigfoot hunter?" I almost laughed. But the look in his eyes wasn't that of a deluded hobbyist. It was the cold, hard focus of a scientist on the verge of a breakthrough. And the $10,000 was very real. Against every instinct screaming at me to send him packing, I heard myself agree. We set out 2 days later. My own gear was standard: a high-powered rifle, a heavy caliber sidearm, bedroll, and enough provisions for 2 weeks, just in case. Blackwood's equipment was anything but standard. In his cases were an array of acoustic sensors, thermal imaging cameras, a device that looked like a Geiger counter, and a collection of custom-made flares. They were thicker than standard emergency flares, with a warning label that read, "Extrame Katiome Mejni Sayam Eflar Buren SAT4 Zausendiritis Dionok Didergirevhoi." The most peculiar item was a knife. It was a heavy, practical hunting knife in a leather sheath, but the handle was inlaid with intricate silver wire, and the crossguard was made of solid, polished silver. It looked ancient and ceremonial. "Silver?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "A precaution," he said without elaborating, his face a blank mask. "Some older traditions suggest it has deterrent properties." The journey to the edge of the basin took a full day of hard hiking. The further we went, the more the landscape seemed to change. The vibrant autumn colors of the lower slopes faded to a dull, monotonous brown. The air grew still and heavy. The cheerful chirping of squirrels and birds died away, replaced by a profound and unnerving silence. It felt like we were walking into a vacuum. By the time we reached the ridge overlooking the basin, the temperature had dropped by at least 15 degrees. A cold that had nothing to do with everything to do with the place itself. The Widow's Basin was a scar on the land. A deep, shadowed bowl filled with a dark, tangled forest of ancient, gnarled pines. A thin, gray mist clung to the valley floor, even in the middle of the afternoon. It looked like a place where things went to die. "We'll make camp here for the night," I said, my voice sounding loud in the oppressive quiet. "We'll head down in the morning." Blackwood didn't argue. He was too busy setting up his equipment, planting his acoustic sensors in a wide perimeter around our chosen campsite. While he worked, I did a quick scout of the area. That's when I found the tracks. They were at the edge of a small clearing, pressed deep into the damp earth. They were not from a bear, or a wolf, or any animal I knew. They were bipedal, but the stride was impossibly long, as if the creature had legs like stilts. The prints themselves were long and narrow, like a human's, but they were wrong. There were only 4 toes, and the front of the foot ended not in a rounded shape, but in a sharp, claw-like impression. I felt a cold dread snake its way up my spine. I had spent my life reading the stories the earth tells, and this story was one I had never seen before. I followed the track line for a few yards. It moved with an unnatural purpose, not meandering like a foraging animal, but heading straight for the ridge where we were planning to camp. It knew we were here, or it knew we were coming. I stormed into the firelight, my hand still resting on the butt of my pistol. My voice came out as a harsh whisper. "What the hell was that?" "Those tracks." Blackwood turned from the darkness. his expression unreadable. The faint smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold, clinical assessment. He didn't seem surprised by my panic. He seemed to have been waiting for it. He said, calmly, his confirmation. "We're in the right place." "The right place for what?" I demanded. "I'm a guide, Blackwood. Not an escort for a suicide mission. You tell me what we're hunting right now, or this trip is over." He gestured for me to sit by the fire, his movements slow and deliberate, as if calming a spooked horse. "There's no turning back now, Jack. It knows we're here. Leaving would be far more dangerous than staying with me." He let that sink in before continuing. "What we are hunting is a persistent, localized predatory entity. The Cree and Ojibwe people who used to inhabit this region had a name for it. They called it a Wendigo," he said, the word as it were a scientific classification. He spoke of it not as a spirit, but as a phenomenon, a creature born from a taboo act. He explained the lore with a chilling detachment. How, in times of brutal famine, a human who resorted to cannibalism would become cursed, their soul corrupted by an insatiable hunger that twisted their body into something monstrous. "So you're telling me," I said, the words feeling absurd on my tongue, "we're hunting a ghost story." "Not a ghost," he corrected. "Flesh and blood. A predator at the absolute apex of its food chain. My research suggests a creature of immense size and strength, with a cunning that borders on human intelligence." He paused, looking into the fire. "Most modern depictions get it wrong. They draw it with a deer's skull for a head, with great, branching antlers. A monster of the forest. It's an easy mistake to make, a way for the modern mind to categorize it, to make it into a beast. But the old stories are much clearer. The horror of the Wendigo is not that it's a beast. The horror is that it was once a man, despite his claims. The image of a stag, like monster, was terrifying than the gaunt 4-toed tracks I had just seen. A beast can be understood. A man-turned monster is an aberration. That night was a descent into hell. The unnatural cold intensified, sinking its deep into us despite the roaring fire. I sat with my back against a large boulder, my rifle across my lap, trying to fight off a wave of exhaustion. But sleep was impossible. The silence of the forest had been replaced by something worse. It started with a branch snapping in the far distance. An ordinary sound, but it was followed, a split second later, by the whisper of pine needles brushing against something right behind my head. It was physically impossible. The wind began to pick up, and it carried voices, faint, distorted whispers that swirled at the edge of hearing. At first, they were just noise, but then they began to resolve into words. I heard my name, Jack, hissed from the trees to my left. Then I heard it again, a soft murmur from my right. The most terrifying moment came near midnight. From deep within the darkness of the basin, I heard a cry for help. It was a man's voice, raw with panic and pain, and it was a perfect, flawless mimicry of my own. "God, somebody help me! I'm hurt!" "Jack? Is that you?" I leaped to my feet, my rifle swinging toward the sound. my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. Blackwood grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't," he ordered, his voice low and urgent. "It's a trick. It's trying to separate us. It's a lure." I felt a profound, irrational paranoia creeping over me. A certainty that the trees themselves were watching, that the shadows were moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. I was a man who had spent his life feeling at home in the wilderness, and now I felt like a cornered animal. I was losing my grip. I turned on Blackwood, my fear curdling into anger. "What else? What else are you telling me?" He saw the thin edges of my sanity and seemed to decide that knowledge was less of a liability than panicked ignorance. He stared into the fire, his face grim. "What we're facing," he began, his voice low and intense, "is a predator that operates on multiple levels. Physically, it's gaunt, emaciated, but don't let that fool you. The legends all speak of unnatural speed and stamina. It cannot be outrun. Its senses are extraordinary. It can hear and smell us from miles away, drawn to our very presence. But its primary weapon is psychological. The voices you're hearing, the paranoia you're feeling. That's a documented phenomenon. Wendigo psychosis. It mimics voices to lure and separate its prey. It wants to break our minds before it attacks our bodies. Trust nothing you hear." He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, the embers glowing brighter. "That's why your rifle is likely useless. The legends are consistent. The only things that can harm it are fire and silver, but even those might only wound it. To kill it, you have to destroy its core, its heart. A heart of ice." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. "Induces paranoia and dread." It wasn't just my fear. The creature was actively attacking our minds. It was a weapon system. A predator that dismantled its prey psychologically before moving in for the kill. The cold I felt wasn't just the temperature, it was a symptom. "The heart of ice?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "The legends are consistent," Blackwood said, his eyes still on the fire. "Some describe it as a literal chunk of ice, in its chest where a human heart should be. Others say it's a metaphor for the coldness of its soul. I'm betting on the former. It's the only way to be sure." We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. The fire our only shield against the oppressive dark. The whispers faded, and the forest fell quiet once more. But this was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of anticipation. The silence of a predator that has finished playing with its food. Then, the smell hit us. It was a wave of putrescence, the thick, cloying stench of a rotting grave mixed with a sharp odor of decay. It was so powerful it made me gag. At the same moment, the fire before us seemed to dim and sputter, the flames shrinking, as if the very heat was being sucked out of them by an invisible vortex of cold. And from the edge of that dying light, a thing of nightmare moved. It was too fast to be seen clearly. A long, bone-thin arm, covered in tight, ash-gray skin, shot out of the darkness. The fingers were impossibly long, tipped with yellowed, jagged claws. It didn't reach for us. It darted toward the rock where we had placed our provisions, with a movement so swift it seemed to defy physics. The skeletal hand snatched a sealed tin of beans and then retracted back into the blackness. It was gone. The stench faded. The fire slowly regained its strength. We were left in the ringing silence, staring at the empty space on the rock. It had been 10 feet away. It had come into our camp, into our light, and stolen our food. It wasn't just a monster. It was intelligent. It was patient. And it was utterly, terrifyingly fearless. The hunt had ended. We were now the prey. Dawn broke not with light, but with a slow, gray dilution of the darkness. The cold had settled into a deep, biting frost that covered everything in a layer of white crystals. Every breath was a cloud of smoke. We hadn't slept. We sat huddled by the embers of the fire, our weapons in our hands, listening to the suffocating silence. The attack, when it came, was not a roar from the darkness, but a silent, fluid movement. It stepped out from behind a thicket of fir trees, and the sight of it broke something in my mind. Blackwood's theory about the stag's skull was a child's fantasy. This was infinitely worse. It was tall, at least 8 feet, but so impossibly gaunt that it looked like a famine victim stretched on a rack. Its skin was the color of old ash, pulled so taut over its skeletal frame that the sharp angles of its bones seemed ready to tear through the desiccated flesh. Its limbs were long and spindly, its movements a horrifying combination of human grace and insect-like quickness. But the head was the true horror. It was fundamentally human, but stripped of all humanity. There were no lips, just tattered, bloody shreds of flesh pulled back from a mouth of long, yellowed fangs. Its eyes were not eyes at all, but deep, black sockets from which an internal, malevolent light glowed like dying coals. It was the shape of a man who had been hollowed out by a hunger so vast it had consumed him from the inside out. There were no antlers. There was no beast. There was only a perversion of the human form, a walking monument to starvation and greed. It moved toward us with a silent, gliding purpose. I raised my rifle, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. I fired. The crack of the shot was deafening in the silent morning. The bullet struck the creature in the chest, punching a neat hole through its torso. It didn't even flinch. It just kept coming. I fired again and again. The rounds passed through its emaciated body, as if through paper, having no more effect than a thrown stone. The rifle's useless, Blackwood yelled, his voice tight with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. He raised the custom flare gun.
It's the core we have to hit!
The heart. He fired. The magnesium flare erupted with a blinding, white-hot glare that turned the gray morning to noon. The creature threw back its head and shrieked. It was not the sound of an animal. It was a high, piercing, tearing sound that felt like it was shredding the air itself, a sound of pure agony and rage. It recoiled from the intense light and heat, its skeletal form moment, terribly silhouetted against the flare's brilliance. The fire was its weakness. It was real. The creature was driven back a few steps, shielding its glowing eyes with one long, skeletal arm. It was hurt, but it was far from defeated. In the chaos of the flare's dying light, it lashed out. It moved faster than I could track, One moment it was 20 feet away. The next it was on top of Blackwood. A long, clawed hand, the nails like shards of yellowed bone, swiped across his chest. The sound was a sickening crunch of breaking ribs and tearing fabric. Blackwood was thrown backward as if hit by a truck, his body slamming into the trunk of a massive pine tree. He crumpled to the ground in a heap. The creature, its gray skin scorched and smoking from the flare, let out another piercing shriek and retreated with impossible speed, vanishing back into the shadows of the basin. I scrambled over to Blackwood. The front of his tweed jacket was shredded, soaked in a dark, spreading stain of blood. His breathing was a shallow, wet rattle. His eyes, when they met mine, were no longer filled with academic curiosity, but with a profound and terrible understanding. "He's real," he rasped, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. His obsession had brought him face to face with his subject, and it had destroyed him. "Don't talk," I said, fumbling in my pack for the first aid kit, knowing it was useless. He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "No time," he coughed, his body shuddering. "It's not just the hunger of the body, Jack. It's a spiritual corruption." Agreed. His eyes were unfocused, looking at something far away. I felt it, a shadow of it in myself. A hunger for more. For knowledge, for power. That's why I came. I had to see it. To know if... His voice trailed off in a fit of coughing. He was a tragic figure. A man whose intellectual greed had made him vulnerable to the very entity he was hunting. The Wendigo was a spirit of insatiable want, and Blackwood, in his own way, had been consumed by the same affliction. With his last reserves of strength, he pushed something into my hand. It was the silver, inlaid knife. Fire and silver. He gasped, his breath failing. "They can hurt it, but they can't kill it. You have to destroy the heart. The heart of ice." He clutched my jacket, pulling me closer until his face was inches from mine. His eyes were wide with a final, urgent terror. "Listen to me, Jack. The most important thing. No matter what happens, no matter how hungry you get, don't eat." He stared at me, his meaning horribly clear. It wasn't just a warning against cannibalism. It was a warning against the psychosis, the unnatural hunger the creature could plant in your mind. Don't let it make you like it. His grip loosened. The light in his pale eyes faded. Arthur Blackwood, the hunter of myths, was dead. I was alone. The sun was a weak, watery disk in the sky, offering no warmth. The only things I had left were a flare gun with 2 remaining shells, a silver knife, and a dead man's terrifying final warning, as if an answer to my despair, from the deep, dark throat of the widow's basin. The creature's shriek echoed through the mountains, a long, triumphant, hungry sound. It knew I was alone now, and it was coming for me. The world became a walking nightmare. I abandoned our camp, taking only what I could carry. Blackwood's flare gun and silver knife, my rifle, which I now knew was useless for anything but noise, and a small pack with the last of our food. I was no longer the guide. I was the hunted. The roles had been brutally reversed. It didn't stalk me from a distance. It stayed close, a constant, malevolent presence in the periphery. It used the forest as its instrument of torture. A branch would fall behind me, and when I spun around, there would be nothing there. It used its terrifying mimicry to break me down piece by piece. I heard the voice of my wife, calling my name, her tone filled with love and concern, luring me toward a dense thicket. I heard Blackwood's academic baritone, calmly explaining that I had missed a crucial detail in his research, urging me to come back to the camp. It was a relentless psychological assault, designed to shatter my sanity and make me easy prey. The environment itself felt like an extension of its will. The already unnatural cold deepened, and a freezing fog rolled in, reducing visibility to a few feet. The familiar trails I knew seemed to twist and turn back on themselves, leading me in circles. The forest was no longer a neutral wilderness. It was the creature's lair, and it was actively conspiring against me. For 2 days, I ran. I barely slept, catching only a few minutes of fitful, nightmare-plagued rest at a time. I rationed the last of my food, a few strips of jerky and a half-melted energy bar. The physical hunger was a dull ache in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a far more terrifying sensation. It was a deeper hunger, a gnawing emptiness in the core of my being. I started to see things. A plump rabbit would dart across my path, and for a split second its form would shimmer and resolve into the shape of a human hand, crawling through the undergrowth. I was hallucinating, my mind buckling under the strain. The paranoia, the anxiety, the visions. I was experiencing the symptoms Blackwood had warned me about. The Wendigo psychosis was taking root. I remembered Blackwood's final, desperate warning. Don't eat. I looked down at my own hands, at the grime under my fingernails, and a wave of revulsion and terror washed over me. The hunger I felt was wrong. It wasn't just for food. I realized then that I couldn't outrun it. To flee was to starve, and to starve was to become vulnerable, to risk succumbing to the very madness that created the monster. My only chance was to turn and fight, not just for my life, but for my soul. On the 3rd day, I stumbled out of the fog-shrouded trees and onto the shore of a small, frozen lake. The ice was a vast, white sheet under the gray sky. It was open, exposed. There was no cover, nowhere to hide. But there was also nowhere for it to hide. Here, I could control the engagement. Here, I would make my stand. I spent the last hour of daylight preparing. I took one of Blackwood's acoustic sensors and placed it at the far end of the lake, using the last of its battery to emit a low, rhythmic pulse, a beacon. Then I waited, huddled behind a rock on the shore, the flare gun in one hand, the silver knife in the other. As dusk settled, it came. It didn't emerge from the trees, but seemed to coalesce out of the fog on the far side of the lake, drawn by the electronic pulse. It moved onto the ice with its silent, gliding speed, its skeletal form a black slash against the white expanse. I let it get to the center of the lake before I made my move. I fired my first flare not at it, but into the air above it. The world exploded in white light. The creature shrieked, blinded, its head thrashing back and forth. That was my chance. I burst from my cover, sprinting onto the ice, my boots skidding. It recovered faster than I expected, its glowing eyes fixed on me, and it charged, its long limbs eating up the distance between us with terrifying speed. I fired my last flare, aiming low. It struck the ice a few feet in front of the creature, igniting with a furious hiss. The intense heat of the magnesium flare didn't just create light, it created a wall of fire and steam as it flashed, melted the ice. The creature, with its innate fear of fire, tried to recoil, but its momentum carried it forward. It stumbled, its long, clawed feet crashing through the weakened ice. It was trapped, half submerged in the freezing water, hissing and shrieking as the flames licked at its body. This was my only chance. With a scream of my own, a sound of pure fear and desperation, I threw myself at it. I landed on its back, the impact jarring my teeth. The cold that radiated from its body was so intense, it felt like a physical blow, burning my skin. I raised the silver knife. It thrashed beneath me, its bony claws tearing at the ice, trying to get a purchase. I ignored the pain, ignored the terror, and drove the knife down with all my strength into the center of its gaunt back, aiming for where its heart should be. There was no resistance of flesh or bone. The silver blade sank in, and I felt a deep, grinding crack, like a sledgehammer shattering a block of ice. I had found its heart. An unearthly cold exploded from the wound, a wave of absolute zero that threw me backward onto the ice. The creature arched its back, its shriek rising to an unbearable, soul-tearing pitch. Then its body began to disintegrate. The ash-gray skin crumbled, the bones turned to dust, and the entire form dissolved into a black cloud that was caught by the wind and blown away across the frozen lake. In seconds, it was gone. All that was left on the scorched, broken ice was the silver knife, glowing faintly in the twilight. A rescue party found me 2 days later, wandering delirious along a logging road. I was suffering from severe frostbite and malnutrition, but I was alive. Physically, I have recovered. But I am not saved. I am back in my cabin, back in civilization, but the world feels thin and unreal. I am plagued by a constant, unshakable paranoia. I can't sleep. And there is the cold, a deep internal chill that no fire can warm. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I feel it. A phantom pang of hunger, a craving for something I can't name. I won the fight. I survived. But I am haunted by the terrifying, persistent fear that when I plunged that silver knife into the creature's frozen heart, a tiny, sharp splinter of the ice broke off and lodged itself forever in my own.